Heavenly Father, today we put on the full armor to protect us against attack. We put on the belt of truth to protect against lies and deception. We put on the breastplate of righteousness to protect our hearts from the temptations. We put the gospel of peace on our feet to walk in your light, peace, and freedom with the Holy Spirit. We rebuke anxious thoughts. We take up your shield of faith for protection to block and destroy all the darts and threats thrown at us by the enemy. We put on the helmet of salvation to cover our minds and thoughts, reminding us that we are children of a mighty King. We are forgiven, set free, saved by the blood of Jesus. We take up the sword of the Spirit, your living word, that has the power to demolish strongholds and is sharper than any double-edged sword. We come to you, Lord, in prayer daily. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and today I'm honored to have back on the show for part 2 of her daytime, nighttime personality podcast series, Ritual Abuse, Child Trafficking, and Mind Control Survivor and Whistleblower, artist and visionary, entrepreneur, gallery and tattoo shop owner, and tattoo cover-up extraordinaire, podcast host and creator of her own incredible educational and informative YouTube channel and podcast at Desert Dakini, fierce mama bear, and our most viewed guest of all time on this podcast and podcast regular, Carrie Olaje. In case you're new here or miss Carrie's first episode where she walks us through her incredible testimony, here's a short recap. Carrie was born into a multi-generational, incest-based family, and from a young age was sold into government-sponsored child slavery and behavioral modification programs with the goal of making her a child assassin, sex slave, and ritual butcher. Her abuse was perpetuated initially by her father, who then passed her on to other owners and handlers who furthered her programming, trafficking, and ritual abuse. I encourage you to go watch the important testimony we did on our first episode and follow-up episodes together, as Carrie quite literally paints us some massive disclosures that give deeper insights into the operational and orchestrated aspects of ritual abuse and abuses that happen within these occult networks. The last time Carrie was on, we ventured down a part 1 episode that took us down the rabbit hole of what it's like to wake up and realize you're living a double life as a mind control asset at night and a civilian by day simultaneously, while having no conscious memory of this occurrence happening day to day, as well as her harrowing and fascinating memories of a gifted and talented / gate field trip and disclosing a celebrity sex trafficking party that involved famous individuals that you would all know by name. I will have part 1 of this series in the show notes, and I encourage you all to go check that out before or after this episode. Today, Carrie is back to continue our deep dive into the daytime, nighttime life of a mind control slave and the personal and professional impact this has on a survivor's life after the programming breaks down and the memories start flooding in. Just imagine waking up one day and realizing that your whole life has been orchestrated. The schools you went to, the friendships you had, the relationships you were in, the career path you took. Imagine that none of these events happened by your own free will, and that all of it was planned in advance, unbeknownst to you, by people who had the audacity to think that they own and control you. This can obviously have some serious implications on a survivor's life to suddenly realize that they're living in the literal true man show, and deciding to leave could mean risking your life, endangering your family, potential retaliation, and or losing everything you have. The devastation of this actualization is a critical point in a survivor's journey, and although it can be tricky to navigate, survivors like Carrie show that it is possible to overcome all of these obstacles in a safe, calculated, and strategic manner that mitigates collateral damage as much as possible. Leaving the cult behind is often the hardest step for a survivor, as there are so many barriers that are arranged to pull them back in, including things like internal system programming, handlers, guilt and shame perpetuated by the family and friends, and even blackmail. The fact that anyone gets out and escapes these networks is nothing short of miraculous, and Carrie herself is a product of this miracle. In typical Carrie fashion, we will be sharing some of her graphic art in this episode, as well as some personal memories she hasn't shared yet publicly. She will also be sharing how her own life is pivoting and how she navigates the difficult situations put in her path that were meant to pull her back into what she risked it all to leave behind. Carrie shines as a beacon of light and hope for us all, and an example of what is possible. And she does so, she gives us the courage to do the same. It is an absolute honor to get to learn from Carrie, and I ask that you all put away whatever you're doing and give this absolute warrior your full attention as she continues to point the weapon of truth at the enemy while blinding them with her light. Before I finish introducing today's guest, I wanted to give just a couple quick reminders and updates. If you'd like to be on the podcast as a guest, share any information privately with me, or submit a written testimony to be published in my upcoming book series or as an article on my Substack, you can email me at imagineabouterworld2020@gmail.com. I'm also proud to announce a partnership with one of my favorite brands, Rife Technologies, which is a new and innovative company dedicated to revolutionizing the health tech industry. The Real Rife machine is an electromagnetic radio frequency device engineered by scientist Dr. Royal Raymond Rife in the 1920s and was used to address various health concerns. These technologies have been used in reference by many guests on this podcast, and I'm excited to announce that you can now gift yourself with 15% off your Rife Technologies order with the discount link and code I have posted in the show notes. All the rest of my links are in the show notes as well, and I'd love your support across all platforms. Thank you all for caring so deeply about survivors and whistleblowers and for helping to make the imagination the safest space on the internet for survivor and whistleblower disclosures. So you guys, without further ado, please help me in welcoming today's guest of honor, voice for the voiceless, podcast host and content creator, walking miracle, anti-child abuse advocate, creative artist, overcomer, and someone I'm grateful to call a dear friend and a force to be reckoned with. The one, the only, Carrie Olaje. Carrie, thank you so much for being here with me, girl. It's good to see you again.
So, hello, Emma. I am super excited to be here again with you today. I had a little location change in case everyone didn't notice because it's mom life and we're always juggling tons of things. But I'm just really excited to be here today. I mean, your intros always do such a good job of summarizing something that feels like impossible to summarize, but you do a really beautiful job of it, and always make me come away feeling very, very lifted up. So thank you. As always, like you're just like a gem of a human, and like I'm honored to call you a friend. So I guess we're having a part two today because in typical DID fashion, like most people that have a lot of different paths in their life, what you tend to find is it's a little hard sometimes to like give a concise, complete story because there were almost like, multiple lives lived. There's a lot of parts that had completely different experiences from each other, and felt like their, growth and life path and everything, was, completely divergent, even though we were all sharing the same body, the same timeline, all of that stuff. So, and especially when you're dealing with someone that has like a lot of like more like the monarch style, like programming and like ritual abuse and a lot of different, certain slaves, they tend to like multi-purpose, so if like you have a particular skill, they're going to use it in multiple different ways if they can. So that's kind of why I'm backtracking today, is that I had kind of like moved forward in my timeline and talking about me being 7, 8, 9. That's like the time I was when I was being bruised. That's a Freudian slip. Abused by Gates essentially, and had the repeated run-in essentially with Pran Malkovich that it created a lot of breakdowns in the system and stuff, but it was something that I had realized, like I was talking essentially about the trafficking side of things. I talked some about um, altar that was mainly in charge of anything that was like sexually violent related, so the dominatrix, child dominatrix side of things, which was where I was at that party, when I was 7, but also the more like assassin type things as well, so times that you're used for violence, um, a lot of times even in training like other slaves, role modeling that kind of stuff, for other kids that are being trained like that, like I had mentioned with uh, like a crime boss, in the Tucson area, basically, like with his kid, it was an intentional role modeling of like violent behavior to another kid to like help, normalize it. It's part of programming, I guess, that I've always seen is there's a lot of times like older kids that are, role modeling the perfect execution, you know what I mean, of whatever skill it is, whether that's sexual or violent or whatever, and I remember myself, ending up in those roles too, like I was saying, like that. So essentially, I've been talking a lot about the more military side of things that I had been dealing with. Davis Monthan Air Force Base was a lot of where my programming went, and that I had been taken to by Gates. And the trafficking stuff. But I hadn't really, I had talked about that initial Washington, D.C. Event, essentially, where they start almost trying to, like, what they see is like, attach entities to you, you're designated to play a certain like role or archetype, like in occult rituals, moving forward, it's all part of the rituals are part of the training itself, but also you're playing the role you're playing in the rituals feels to them, spiritually, significant and everything. So that was my early experience with that DC ritual I talked about, but I had kind of skipped over a lot of the in between, I guess, occult side of the programming, because that was very much like what my my I guess like the layers, that it's like I've dealt with through healing and everything, is just realizing, there was a track, of myself that felt like a perfect soldier and assassin, there was those parts, there was the front parts, which were the hippies and the artists, like just totally peace loving and like just very meek, like not confident and stuff, but very skilled artistically and academically and everything. And then there was the occult stuff, which was more tied into like the royalty and NWO style stuff because of the whole entity attachment and stuff like that. That was kind of the whole basis for why I was like, um, you know, maybe given those rituals, but then also, lifted up as like, there's a definite distinction in like, monarch stuff, that there's like hierarchy slaves, and then there's like basically the throwaways, essentially the people that they see as like that they're not traumatizing for a purpose. They're almost just trauma, they're just using them as fuel to traumatize the kids that they quote unquote, care about, which is just means that you just endure a lot of abuse, but they also make sure that they do what they can to make sure that you don't die, you know what I mean? And that they also, because there's a lot of money and time invested into like programming very specialized skills into like children and stuff like that. But they also create a lot of programming that or scenarios that are meant to create a lot of loyalty, within you and the system, and a lot of like that Stockholm syndrome, like almost like an embrace of your role as having a position in the hierarchy as a slave because it's better than, like the countless, really horrible things you've seen, that you've been shown, happens to, slaves that they consider are expendable or just, meant to be, it's very Nazi-esque, like all of this belief system is 100%, this idea that you have like the desirable people, and then you have the less than, and for me, it was often like Gates was seen as like the bloodline super desirable, you know what I mean? And I was considered good enough, to be lifted into those circles, via my dad selling me, you know what I mean, to be like a slave, basically. So I guess that's some of the stuff that I had wanted to backtrack on, that had gone on essentially in Washington, D.C. and Texas and stuff that kind of shows like some of the preliminary programming I hadn't really gone over too much in the past. That kind of shows how you develop, parts and belief systems that have the same ideologies basically as, your Illuminati, Luciferian fucking captors, you know what I mean? So, and it's not like, for me, it's like a big part of healing because, like, I've mentioned many times, like, many, many times, that, like, you're only as healed as like your sickest voices kind of in your head basically, and that like that on a certain level like we have to acknowledge that like like we're DID, we're not schizophrenic, this is not like some random crap, this is essentially internalized trauma basically, and when you take that context to what's going on in your life, it's like what I've found, the episode I did, redeeming demons, like was really about, kind of just helping people understand, the parts that they probably have the most difficulty with, because I know in my experience I did too. And those are the perpetrator allied parts. And a lot of times, even internally, you're going to want to push them away, and that's always been a very antagonistic relationship typically within the system. I mean, that's what keeps the system programming intact a lot of times, is this inability to see eye to eye. Yeah, so just the parts that are that in my experience like you have to deal with like maybe towards the end, because if you're early in healing, you're going to be like, dude, those fucking crazy demon voices, those crazy, intrusive thoughts, those XYZ, all of that shit, you're going to be just trying to, push it away. And I'm not saying to like necessarily like embrace it either, but more to like come to these things from a place of like investigation, and like acknowledgement and stuff like that. And that like in my experience, the most like speed and healing, the times that I felt like I've leapt forward the most is the times when I as a front person have chose to like judge less essentially, and to just sought to like understand like what I went through because a lot of it is because it is coming from the mind of a child, and you're not going to understand it on the level you think you should, until you really are able to communicate with that part and have some context for stuff, So I'm hoping to give some context today, S5E has been super helpful. Laura Worley, Kathy O'Brien, and these people sharing their, and like a jillion, like, man, so many other people on your channel and just sharing their experiences a lot of times when you're dealing with stuff like can just very much like normalize it and kind of lead to an end to that internal conflict, because there's suddenly an understanding of like what the other person is saying. And a lot of times in the cult allied stuff, especially this ritual abuse stuff, or especially VR stuff that's like more military crap, but anything that's like really, it's all like imagination based basically, so it kind of takes being able to like imagine yourself out of it too basically. But it's hard to like really like show, like if a part has been convinced that this is their reality forever, you know what I mean, you have to like show them basically. But it's also hard to like know how to show them unless you really understand where they're coming from, which sometimes can seem really crazy or like out of context, like dealing with fantasy stuff or alien stuff, or sometimes like demony type stuff, not saying that there aren't validity to these experiences as well, but a lot of times it's stuff that's totally made up that is, used against us, against our child minds to create very firm beliefs. And when we can finally see the play that was essentially put on for us in those parts in these times of intense trauma, it a lot of times can lead to a lot of like understanding essentially for the, from part to not just be like, oh, you're just crazy for thinking this way, but it's like you step back and you can see the situation, be like, oh, like you were a kid in like an insane situation, maybe being drugged, definitely being tortured in some way, you know what I mean, psychologically, physically, etc. So, I can see, like a bully, why you came to these crazy conclusions about the world or about your life or your identity, all this kind of stuff, and then that leads to like bridging the gap, and starting to have some relief, in the I don't know, in the very dualistic, like we're talking about, kind of nature to especially, monarch or ritualized programming where there is a very intense, splitting of parts against each other and hemispheres literally in the brain or brain states and stuff like that. So sorry, that was like a little all over. I always feel a little all over the place. So hopefully you get some context for why we're backtracking and, yeah.
That was really helpful. I love how you explain some of these really complex things. You blow me away every single episode. You say something in a way that I'm like, oh my gosh, that makes so much more sense than like what I was comprehending. This stuff can be really foreign to people like me who didn't go through it, but yet I'm interacting with people who did, and trying to put myself in their shoes. And it gets so hard sometimes if it's such a foreign experience. And so having it broken down in like these very simplistic ways that you do so beautifully is really helpful for the audience. And you get a lot of comments too from survivors who are like, oh my gosh, Carrie's helping me put verbiage and, visuals and context to something that I couldn't explain myself. This is really important to understand because I think that it's very confusing, especially for somebody who has DID to experience those conflicts and to want to just shove it back down instead of saying, okay, it's let's just say a conflicted company staff, and looking at it
Yes.
like a unit and saying, how do we fix this so we can all drive the ship the same way instead of having all this dysfunction inside, instead of just firing people or silencing them, to be like, all right, I'm going to listen to you and like figure out why you feel the way that you do, why you see the world the way that you do, like you said. That's a really awesome way that you just explained a really hard concept for people to understand. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you, Emma. Like I definitely feel like that's a lot of like what other people have done for me. And that's why I tell people to just do things when it's where it's at in your healing, basically. Cause for me, that's where a lot of like validation has come, is just, doing all the journaling, doing the memory work, all that kind of stuff and dealing with it. And then, that's usually the point when I start like, once I've dealt with a memory fully, then it's like that's the point when I allow myself to like try and validate it basically and to start looking for like other survivors' experiences, or pulling out the books, you know what I mean, of the different survivors of something and saying like, hey, is this like so, and it's insane like how every single time, there is a ton of validation, and that's also like a testament to how like not creative our abusers are. There's a reason kind of like, Gray has put together in like some recent presentations and everything. There's a reason like everyone's shit is like based off of like the Kabbalah tree of life to a degree, or has like grids, geometric structure, to it and everything. And a lot of it comes back to like the fact that, the Nazi origins of this as a systematized thing, but even before that in occult mystery religions and stuff, that it's like, what we're experiencing with a lot of monarch people is like the synthesis of like multiple, different faiths, mystery religions, etc., that they've, they're very brass tacks, psychopaths, and they just figure out, these group of pedophiles figured out what worked for programming certain shit, and this one figured out, other stuff, and they've essentially all shared it, and they don't really have like true religious convictions or ideologies or stuff like that. They just care about like what works and what gets them their shit, which is why you see over and over that like survivors are able to validate each other's experiences and everything, because so much of our shit is like variations, we of the same thing, like no, not everyone's path is the same, because we all, I think they, the organized crime chooses us for specific ends, and then they have to adapt to, as we'll be talking about, as life progresses, and how like we, our souls trying to escape, essentially, and try, they're having to constantly adjust the programming, life paths, session, that kind of stuff. But ultimately, they still want us like under control, essentially, and that's like what so much of our our system programming, all that stuff, why it's so consistent is because they've just tried to figure out, you know what's Fritz Springmeier's book, it's like the it's like the formula to create like I don't even remember, mind controlled slave or something. I can't remember the name of Fritz's book. It's another very helpful resource that he wrote with Cisco Wheeler. But essentially, it's a formula. There is a formula to it, and if you have gone through like this level of ritual abuse and military training type of stuff, like you're probably going to have similar shit. So just having, like we're saying, some context goes a long way, because then you can be like, okay, like it's my memories when they were first coming up of me being in the kennel, like I thought that was an impossible thing. Like no one ever has kids in cages, you know what I mean? Like, and then to come across, all Kathy O'Brien stuff about like the bestiality and different crap like that. And I was just like, oh, it was like she was writing my same story, like 20 years ago or something, or 30. I don't even know how long it was, but regardless, yeah. So the main stuff I kind of wanted to like kind of backtrack to was, I guess the first thing we'll do is probably pull up the photographs that I brought today. Okay. So that's my dad right there, and that's me in his shirt. And I'm just going to point out a few things that people will notice me referencing as like we continue the episode. Um, Obviously, he's got a big old smile on his face, and I'm inside his shirt. And yes, his shirt has a Playboy bunny on it. The other images on this page in the photo album were both like me naked in the bath. So I wasn't sure if he had a hand in putting this particular page together. I would not doubt it. But referring back to the occult training and the hierarchy, royalty kind of training and stuff like that. A symbol, that was used a lot in my particular training essentially was the unicorn. So what you can see kind of above my dad's head, yeah, so basically this is Washington, D.C. This is the condo that I had mentioned being taken out of before, to go to Walter Reed and everything. But yeah, the unicorns. So essentially, my dad was never really into, Frank was never really, I'll probably refer to him a lot as Frank. He was never really into like fantasy crap or anything like that, but we always had, that was the only decorations essentially that he ever had was unicorns, basically. So there was these two brass unicorns you can see there. And then behind it is like, you'll see like a crystal chalice, or a crystal like vessel, and then there's two crystal chalices that have unicorns as like their bases, on either side of it, which, for anyone who's been through ritual abuse will know, the goblets, that decanter, that's the word I was looking for, the silver decanter between them, it's all very reminiscent, of what you might see at a ritual, basically. So the main reason I wanted to bring this up was to kind of show people how early both the abuse and the programming starts, essentially, and that my father Frank was like 100% complicit in it. This is obviously before my earliest memory I've talked about. Essentially, I'm not a good judge of age, but maybe, I don't know, 9 months, a year there or something like that. And essentially what was already around me, was, well, for one, who knows, this might have been something, a copy he even sent to Gates to show that he was like doing everything right. But regardless, what was used in my programming later was always a lot of unicorn stuff, a lot of unicorn symbolism. So it kind of, for me as a survivor, was very mind blowing to look back at these, family photos and to see how early all of this symbolism had been put around me, essentially. And I had asked my mom actually too, like, because unicorns seem like a very feminine thing. So early on in healing, I knew that there was something weird around it, even though I hadn't yet gotten to the point of dealing with, all of it. I had unicorn, a very prominent unicorn part in my system. It was a part of why I had always thought I was totally delusional and a crazy person, basically, was because some of my most vivid memories that I had, because I had very few growing up, was that I was convinced I was going to turn into a unicorn, and like just escape. And this was during, this is front back life. So this was during middle school, during around the time of the George Miller uh ritual at Karchner Caverns and stuff, when I started having some programming breakdown. And essentially, all I wanted to do was escape, essentially, and it's like, because this part had always been so prominent, I was like, it was literally like my um like replacement for like God and mother, basically. It was kind of the closest way that I have to like describe it, but it was still like a cover, like kind of controlled opposition, like a cover for where, if they're creating a, you know, a mind controlled slave that they want to be completely controlled, then they want to control, like controlled opposition. They want to have both your comfort objects as well as the things that are in your system there to punish you and scare you and everything. So um you can go ahead and pull that down wherever you feel like it. Um but so essentially, for me, it was just something I wanted to bring up in Washington, D.C. time, to just kind of show that, like, for a survivor, like that, like you were talking about in the intro, it can be a lot to come to terms with, that essentially you've had your whole life on a certain level crafted around you, just to keep you in a mental and sometimes physical cage, essentially. Um, when it came to the other stuff I had wanted to mention, it kind of all centers around the figure that I've referred to before as Mistress Diana. She was essentially, I had mentioned her in the hunting feast event a couple, maybe 2 episodes ago or so. Um, it was had like the big like table with flames around it, and it was a butcher training event, a cold butchery training event, basically. And essentially, I wanted to bring her up, just to help people like really conceptualize that, especially for like hierarchy type stuff, that you're going to be role modeled. It's a lot of trauma bonding, basically, that it's basically what you're going to be dealing with is, usually an older version of you, kind of like role modeling stuff, but also that is a lot of why, um, I don't know how to describe it. Like, you feel so bonded to them is on a certain level because soldier shit. It's like that they went through the same stuff as you, and it also feels like that they, just like any programmer, are kind of trying to convince you that what you're going through is for your own good. For your betterment in some way. Giving you a more important role in, well, ultimately the world, because that's like what was sold to me a lot in my programming and everything, was the goddess type stuff, was this idea that, like, you know we, like me and Mistress Diana and the other like women that I had experienced, partaking in rituals, in the covenant types and occult type stuff, that basically that there was some way that we were saving the earth, you know what I mean? Like that we were like protectors of Mother Earth and humanity was horrible, and that we were essentially, this was, we were Mother Earth's avenging force, basically. It's the very typical Nazi, like Illuminati kind of ideology where you put nature ahead of, humanity, which obviously we need to live in balance with nature. But, that doesn't, a lot of people know that overpopulation shit is like total BS, you know what I mean? At this point, and that they just are interested in killing people because they just want a manageable population, not because, we're stressing the earth. The reason we're stressing the earth is because corporations are run by psychopaths that don't give a fuck. You know what I mean? It's not the 99% of people that are just hanging out, taking what is given to us by the corporations. But obviously the opposite ideology, what they convince us of as kids essentially is that, the total opposite, that humans are evil and, on Earth, except for their particular, little club, obviously, which lucky you get to be part of, as long as you have to hurt a lot of innocents and everything like that. But those parts are really created in so much trauma that like that's been so much of my healing, throughout my adulthood, is when you are finally getting through to these parts, that they were lied to, that they were traumatized and everything. It is a mind fuck for them to realize how much pain all the other parts went through, you know what I mean? Because on a certain level, they have their traumas, but if they're put up as hierarchy parts in the system as well, which you typically have for the cult, the perpetrator allied parts are the ones set up in the system to be ruling things. They don't even really, because they have parts that take a lot of the emotional and physical pain, they don't even have an understanding that you have been abused as much as you have. Those are the parts that have almost associated their abuse the most. That's why they've been able to play this role in the system, a very psychopathic role for a lot of people, is because they have, they have been in a position where a lot of times intentionally, because of the abusers, training them that way, they've been able to dissociate all of the, really intense stuff and really just associate with the more love bombing, the more, the more trauma bonding kind of stuff, basically. So that is been a huge thing in the system, getting towards, getting towards just having complete understanding and everything like that, is that a lot of the parts that were holding those roles essentially were holding them because they literally had no idea. They literally had no idea how much, just like we experience as fronts when we start dealing with our amnesia breaking down. They had no idea that, their ideology was so fucked, for one, you know what I mean, or that they themselves had been the ones that were tortured so many times. It's once they can really take that delusion from their eyes, and see their abusers for what they are, it goes a long way to taking that trauma bond shit that we struggle with as survivors and just kind of sweeping it off the table, because it's oh, that person that you thought you were having a good time with at this particular, event or something like that. If it was Gates, for example, because I had been, like I mentioned many times, these parts that I'm talking about had been conditioned from a very young age at Walter Reed to see Gates as my love of my life, basically, a fucking gross 50, a 5-year-old and a 50-year-old. You know what I mean? And it's and that's it just seemed he was, the end all and be all and everything like that. And those parts, were given experiences where you're taken shopping or taken to something cool, or because they have all their negative emotions dissociated, can go to a ritual and just tune out the fucked up shit happening and just focus on the social side of things, basically, um so one the main thing, that I really wanted to come back to with like, I guess with Mistress Diana is to kind of show the other like levels of training and how she kind of like evidenced that in and of herself, because she was in and of herself had different parts that would, do provide different training for myself. And so that's why I was saying that she pretty much had the same role as me, because she trained me both in the occult butchery side of things and like the ritual stuff, basically, but also was the one training me in the sexual sadism, essentially, you know what I mean? And then also, as well, I don't know how to put it, like the etiquette side of things, the charm side, like, so essentially, um, one of my early memories at the bunker that I had wanted to talk about was that um, I don't know if I have talked about this, so let me know if I have. Is that it kind of connects to all of the unicorn programming, basically, and what essentially was later on, the Paris attacks or the Paris ritual, which was a week or two before the Paris attacks in 2015. That essentially, like, it was a training event where I had been taken to the bunker in Texas. And this typically would happen, like, I guess the best way for me to describe to people as I talk about the kennel of those kind of memories is that the time I was in the kennel, it was like over a week, for my best understanding, was very much like trauma school to where if you can envision that there is, classes and periods and stuff like that, it's like a literal boot camp, but for multiple different parts to where there was, there was, the, wolf parts and dog parts brought out for, bestiality and NWO training, a lot of times at morning and evening time. Midday, well, a lot of times was all soldier stuff. So it's like they would switch you to different parts. And now you're dealing with like, parts that are, sometimes they would pull up a couple because that's one thing I've maybe mentioned before, but a lot of people that are DD NOS have altered teams, so most of the time we're not like a singleton, it's like that we have like a lot of times programmed teams essentially to where it's like you're a lot of times going to have a front personality. You're going to have essentially your, more subdued, personality. Me, I usually had four essentially that were like always there. And then I had a cult allied one that was pretty much always there to, to ensure that programming was intact, ensure that like we weren't thinking or doing things that we weren't supposed to, it's like you had essentially like a watchdog, that is built in to essentially, move you away and enact other like torture programs of different things, distraction, different stuff to move you away, from like if you start in your daytime life, asking questions you shouldn't internally, you know what I mean? Or start acting out certain things like sexually or different things that you're not supposed to, it's like you have parts there to be like, if you get triggered to essentially put a quash on it so that you don't display it, essentially, it's like a internal backup mechanism that they kind of put in. So for me, if it was soldier training, it would have been both Jade and my soldier part that would both be called out. So it'd be all the parts that were soldier related. Midday, you'd be doing, physical stuff, maybe, a lot of like, obstacle course stuff, or like some of the more physical, like grappling, like combat-y type stuff, because I'd mentioned being able to, being trained with a knife and everything like that. And then, like I said, evening would usually be back to doing some stuff with like the wolf or dog parts, essentially. So hunting type exercises. And then a lot of times at nighttime, that's when Mistress Diana would show up, and it would switch for me working with, Gates and those handlers to working with essentially mainly her and Gates, to where we would be at the bunker or an event. Like I had mentioned, that hunting one with the little boy basically was one of those nights basically where we, I would be taken, to, specific location, and there's specific training going on. For that, it was like on the job training, at an event where I was shadowing her, for the butchery side of things, essentially. But it was also, I was going to say, but it was also going to the bunker a lot, basically, because that's one thing that I constantly want to bring up to people is like, at least my particular bunker, I've always wondered if it's the same that Katie Groves talked about, or similar, because it could be based off of like the location. But if not, I know there's a lot of like related ones in Central Texas and stuff. But in any case, that from my recollection, like my particular bunker was very much for, or had a ton of facilities for the snuff pornography filming, so a lot of different like sets, basically sets, locations and stuff like that. Um, or places for entertaining blackmail, so I had mentioned before with like, having rooms that are just, set up for sex parties or, just entertaining people basically. And they're, they have obviously like cameras and different crap like that too. Um, but that with the royalty and unicorn kind of style programming that we went through with Mistress Diana, that was a lot of, and the sexual sadism, that was all stuff that went on in the bunker, basically, because you had the facilities, you had the locations to create these, experiences, basically. So when it came to like what she taught, and this kind of ties back to the unicorn stuff, is that like one really distinct training memory that I had with her was essentially going to the bunker to a almost like a ballroom type location, where it was like a stage, and it had like a bunch of like tables and stuff. It was not in use, at the time, but it was essentially a place where I went and I met two older girls, basically, that were deemed, that we were essentially called the Hapsburg unicorns, basically. So that they were, and this is where I'm like, I don't know for sure. Did I mention, have I talked about this before?
Mm-mm.
No? Okay. I was just making sure. So essentially, um, I'm pretty sure, I don't know. I haven't done any genealogy, but I'm pretty sure Gates is because he's got German genealogy, but who knows where I have a Mexican last name that it seems like no one believes is Mexican. So who the fuck knows who my blonde or my blue-eyed, grandfather, my Mexican grandfather was, but someone's related to the fucking Habsburgs. Essentially, I'm pretty sure it's Gates. So like I said, this is like where it sucks being in the position of not being able to like have the time and money to do like all the research to understand, our memories, basically. But I'm honest, this is where we're at, and this is the journey of survivors, unfortunately. But essentially, we were known as the Hapsburg unicorns, so, and they very much looked down on me. There were a couple girls that were older than me. I think the oldest one looked like she was 12, and then there was a girl at maybe about 10 or so. Um, they were both like socialite class, basically. So they were there also for a training event with Mistress Diana. It was a training event for the three of us. I was the youngest. And they very much looked down on me because I was like not like I was seen as like, a poor person. You know what I mean? I was seen as like, and they were seen as like, like um bloodline, their jobs like were very different than mine. Like they weren't being trained in any of the like I was gonna say like assassin type stuff. Like their stuff was, well, I can't say that for sure, but really like what they came back to was that their jobs, their fronts, all that stuff, was that they were going to be, they were going to be socialites. They were going to marry wealthy, were, going to play their, I'm sure, their black mother roles with their kids and all that kind of stuff, um, but that essentially, they were there, to be trained as well, where we essentially were being trained in etiquette stuff, so for these parts, it's not super traumatizing compared to all the other shit you've been through if you're just, learning how to converse in a charming way or how to dance, some simple shit, you know what I mean? Or how to, like, later on when they bring in, dudes in their business suits, how to sexually service, them and interact with them as a fucking, essentially like a high priced escort, you know what I mean? Like, that was that whole thing, and um, just essentially, to know that one, that there were other girls that, were going through the same unicorn shit to me was like kind of like mind blowing, to think about. But it is very common to have crossover between different survivors and symbolism and stuff. But it was also just knowing the fact that like later on in my life, like that's kind of what had like come up. I guess we're jumping around a bit, but if you want to pull up the one with the tables, essentially, um, I had talked in the past before about the cruise event that I had gone to with my aunt, who was a handler. And essentially, so this was like on the cruise, basically. And when I talked about the Paris event, this was essentially a signing. It's me in the black dress, and then there's Gates next to me, and then his like assistant right there. He usually had an assistant with him, signing papers, basically. Across the way is like my cousin, and then over on the side one is like my aunt and her friend who were like also attending the cruise event, which is why I was saying it was obvious to me, like looking back on it, that it was, there was a lot of cult members on that cruise, you know what I mean? And they had a lot of after party stuff. But when I was signing that contract there, this is referencing back to the Hapsburg unicorn stuff, that was when I had been essentially left alone for several years, but then had gotten tapped for reprogramming for them to use me for the occult abuse again, for the Paris ritual that I had talked about. And what they had told me, Gates had told me there at that, contract signing, and the parts of me that are signing are these parts that we're talking about, parts that feel like they're part of some bigger plan, some bigger hierarchy. They don't have any real context for, the amount of suffering that they went through or caused and everything like that. It just feels like you're, um, you know, everything always felt to me like it wasn't a decision, almost like it was more like an assignment that was put in front of you, like a school assignment, and you just had to do your best, do your best at it. You know what I mean? So with that signing, basically, it was me, quote unquote, they do a lot of this dog and pony stuff, like basically agreeing to, come back into the fold, as a member in the occult hierarchy, and start performing rituals again. And it was me agreeing to essentially be the one performing the Paris ritual, where it was a toddler, that had been that I had participated in sacrificing, essentially. And that was sorry. Um, so that was like what was explained to me was that the two girls that I just talked about, the other Habsburg unicorns, were supposed to be there performing that ritual in Paris in 2015, but one of them had passed away already. And then the other one, they said, was scheduled to be pregnant at the time, essentially. So that I had to, that's Gates had been very excited on that cruise, that I had essentially been called back up for service, essentially. That's why I was reprogrammed on that cruise and stuff. I mean, probably in addition to, they do it a lot with survivors to head up any healing, basically. But for me, it was a lot of stuff like making sure all of that programming was still active, and then, at the very end of it, after all the torture and everything, giving me a royalty experience at the very end, that to where you are essentially agreeing to continue signing away your life, you know what I mean, and playing a role for them, in an insanely dissociated state. So I'm gonna take a quick drink real quick if you want to pull that down. But do you have any questions at all?
No, just thank you for, explaining this again in a way that I feel only you can do justice to. You have such a good style of explaining this, and it really does go to show like how complex this is and how arduous it is. It's not like it's just once in a while that this happens. This sometimes it sounds like was like literally morning to night, flipping between different personalities and accomplishing different tasks.
Sometimes.
Yeah, and that's like, probably really hard for people to comprehend too that, they would be doing all this to a child, like running them through military training as a child and combat training and, like just it's really sad. And then thinking about all the places that they were having you travel, all the locations that this takes place, it's like it's really scary to think about the world that we live in and how this is all literally just, right in front of our faces and we miss out on it, but it's so validating for other survivors who feel very alone in their experiences, don't have people to talk to, like you said, the validation, and hearing like, okay, like my memories aren't crazy, like other people have went through something like what I did. It's not crazy, it's real and this stuff happens and it's still happening, so
Yeah.
really appreciate you just shedding a light on this. You go really deep into it, and I think people need to hear it. I think it's time that this stuff needs to come to light, and people need to really understand what all is entailed with this BS that they do. And seeing that picture with your dad, like how young they start, whether it's actual like abuse or symbolism, like it's all around you pretty much from the time that you're born. They're prepping you for all of this, and it's just really wild to consider that this was your life, that you had so many different things happening at once, and being a kid's hard enough, like just going to school and like trying to figure out like how to be a kid, and like growing up and thinking about all this stuff in the background. It really does illustrate that double life, and how so many different things can be happening simultaneously and how crazy it is that our bodies can do things where we're not consciously even aware that it's happening,
Yeah.
so
Oh, totally. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, it is like a mind fuck, you know. It's also like what helps like wrap, your head around it, like we were saying, as a survivor, because it I think for me, it did feel almost like when you're dealing with all of that shit, it does almost feel like impossible until you can really see your complete timeline, It's like, how could I have gone through this much or had this much training or different stuff until you realize, it's like I have my mom's um, you know, military record, basically that just shows, that, when I was like 18 months old, 18 months to 2 years old or so, it's like I had 3 weeks that I was alone with my dad, and that means that I was alone with programmers. That doesn't mean I was alone with my dad. That means that, that if from my recollections, if there were times that my mom was gone for an extended period of time, I spent time with him, but I didn't spend like a whole lot of time with him. That's when these events, so a lot of times my mom's training, a lot of different stuff was coordinated essentially, and her pregnancy, so she was on bed rest for a lot of the occult abuse that was happening at this time, basically like so 6 or so, was a time period where, in addition to 3 military train times throughout my life, about 2 years spaced apart, I had around a month or so that they had complete access to me, essentially. That essentially, there was another 3 months at the end of her pregnancy, essentially, which is when most of this stuff was going on. So, but it's also what people need to understand is like what is very intentional for slaves that are like Swali, for slaves that are like me, that they did choose like some sort of like hierarchy role, or did want me to have like an important occult role or different stuff is that they don't want you to be a junkie throwaway thing. They want you to have a front life that is somewhat normal and respectable and everything. And that is a lot of what almost like helps solidify the programming too, because if you do have a very healthy, normal, people saw my dad's alcoholism, they saw different issues, but on the whole, it was a very typical narcissistic family structure where everything on the outside was white picket fences, you know what I mean? And that is just part of like that is part of the program, gaslighting yourself into being like, you know, I have all these PTSD, I have all this like shit I'm dealing with, throughout my life. And it's like, it's me that's the crazy one. I just have a normal life. Like, what the fuck is wrong with me? And it's like, yeah, but they very intentionally, like, they want you to have that loving Christian, whatever part, normal part of yourself, because it both gives them a cover, and then, also gives you internally a cover of, denial, essentially, that you can kind of like constantly be battling against, um, and I was gonna say, I think that I went over most of that stuff, except for I think that maybe the next thing that would make sense to pull up that's along these same lines is the image with like the castle in it. So this is like some internal world like programming type stuff, and it kind of like it illustrates, I guess, like what I like to talk about with like the essentially like the layers of programming that you'd be dealing with. Some people are dealing with. Not everyone is the same, but you know, castle programming is insanely common just in general. It's very old school, like kind of form of stuff and everything. I've kind of realized that Gates liked a lot of, he was an older guy, his particular programming stuff he liked, seemed to be a lot more analog crap than digital, although there was also that later on. But regardless, he had his fucking medieval, fantasy stuff too, and a lot of stuff was very druidic. So all of my stuff, was typically built off of castle type stuff. So, um, like how to envision, like what we would be experiencing essentially. So around middle school time, basically, was that actually I'm going to backtrack a tiny bit. So I guess the last thing I was going to talk about in the bunker was like the actual unicorn programming. Um, I don't care if you leave this up; it doesn't really matter. But when it comes to that, so go ahead and leave it up. Actually, sorry.
Sure.
Because I'm like, it's yeah, go ahead and leave it up because it is relevant. So essentially, like when it comes to the unicorn programming, is that they really did solidify for me that like early on, I was given experiences with like fake unicorns, as in like a horse with like a horn on his head, like that was a lot to cuddle with and stuff like that, when I was really young, essentially, like did have those bonding experiences to where they like you really internalize, the look, of, what that object is, and stuff. So for me, unicorn. And then essentially, later on in the bunker before we left, essentially there was a huge kind of show put on to really install my father as my main handler and everything. And that was essentially like what they do is they're creating these different roles in the system. So that's why a lot of times you'll have things based off of stories, so Alice in Wonderland, like, Wizard of Oz, like they provide templates essentially to create like a role in your head. So for me, like I went through an event where essentially I had been taken to what was like a pleasure garden in the bunker. It was massive, it had insanely high ceilings, like kind of like airbrushed clouds and shit like that. It was highly well lit, but it was large. It was Disneyland-esque, to where it had paths, it had a forest, it had like a little fake river type thing, you know what I mean? But essentially, it was an experience where to set up my dad as my main programmer and to really kind of create this role for him in the system as like almost like a all powerful dark magician, you know, all knowing dark magician, basically, is that, you know, we were brought to this pleasure garden and then drugged. And then it's like looking in the mirror or the, you know, in the, uh, looking in the, sorry, looking in the, uh, fake stream, basically. They had like what, you know, it's almost like you look like you're going to be looking at yourself in the mirror, you know, your reflection in the stream, basically. But instead, they have a picture of a unicorn. And I remember the feelings of maybe being on like LSD or something like that. So this is also like six or so, you know, so you're feeling some hallucinogen kind of effects, you know, you're having this like amazing experience with your dad, you know, because you still are trauma bonded to him. And essentially, what ends up happening is like you look at yourself, you know, you're a unicorn, and you look at yourself in the stream and you see your reflection. And what do you know? There's a picture of a unicorn, you know, and you're like convinced, you know, that this is, you know, this is the case and everything like that. And then goblins come out of the woods and essentially like your dad's like run save yourself, and all of a sudden you're running, you know, it goes from a beautiful idyllic experience to now you're running, you know, hearing your dad getting attacked and you're running through the woods basically like a scared little child, because you know that's it, you know, I don't even know how to explain this experience, you know, but essentially, you know, you can't really escape adults obviously, so after like running through this like wooded, you know, like I said, there was these were like essentially movie sets is the closest way that I can like really describe it to people, is like movie sets of varying sizes. And this one was like a large, I call it pleasure garden. You know, it had different like little areas and like there was like a gazebo in one area, you know, that the goddess parts of me had experienced, you know, some like royalty type training type stuff where you're just pampered, et cetera, et cetera. So different parts have training experiences often in like the same locations, but don't have access to each other's experiences. So essentially, you know, I was captured by these goblins, you know, these people in ghillie suits and shit. You know, they weren't goblins, obviously, but I was a child on LSD, so or something like it, you know. So it's like obviously you're not able to tell that. But essentially when you see like the on the right side, so those are images from the internal system, but those are also almost identical to like the next scene, you know, which is essentially being taken from the pleasure garden, you know, through, you know, a like a dungeon hallway, you know, which is there was a lot of stuff like that in the bunker that's very utilitarian, you know, concrete rows of doors of unknown shit, you know what I mean? Um, and you know, sitting, taking, kicking, and screaming there, and into what was essentially like what you see below it, you know, which is a very stereotypical like medieval torture dungeon type thing, where you know my you know, I, you know, was proceeded to be like strapped down to like, you know, the torture table essentially. And then, you know, you're freaking out and everything. And who comes in, you know, but it was, you know, it's the black magician. They tell me that's going to come and like, you know, kill me and take my horn because I'm a unicorn, obviously. You know what I mean? And do all this like shit basically. And of course, who comes in but my dad and robes basically, you know, and it's like, so it was like this whole mind fuck that, you know, he was the evil magician and all this, you know, shit. There's this whole ritual that they did with this, you know, sexual abuse and then symbolically cutting off my horn and then saying that they was you know, it was something that they had possession of now, you know, and that meant that they had possession of my magic and possession of my heart and all this, like, you know, all this bullshit that you're telling to a kid. But essentially, you know, it made it to where, you know, moving to Tucson and stuff at that point, he was 100% solidified as like my main handler, to where he knew all my cues, triggers, you know, different, not all of them, you know, but a lot of them, you know, because everything he needed to know basically to keep me triggered on a regular basis and to do what essentially, make me jump through the hoops that Gates expected, but also to obviously have like a role of like intimidation and all this other stuff to create you know uh my experience. I'll be referring to kind of like to the middle school like Karchner times a bunch, because that's just when a lot of these memories are from essentially later on, was just that I felt like internally I was a captive unicorn essentially, and that when like I had internalized these locations too. Like when they give you a system, there's going to be a structure to it. So for mine, it was a castle, and because of that, there's a dungeon in a castle. So what they will have you do is essentially be placing, like internalizing this location as like a location in your internal system because you've experienced it. Obviously, you have trauma memories attached to it. But then when you have perpetrator allied parts that are playing the roles of your perpetrators in the system, they now have access to these locations to use them in the same way, essentially. So um, that's a lot of what punishment programming is that a lot of survivors deal with, is that they're going to have like a cache, a location, essentially. And for me, that was the dungeon there, and then also those cracks you see around the castle, like these like pits, very Lord of the Rings esque, um, torture pit, hell pit type shit. You know what I mean? Where essentially you are instructed to store all of your most horrible like torture memories and emotional like pain, all that kind of stuff, but for two reasons. One, to essentially you know make it to where it's dissociated and it's not something you're reacting on a lot, and you're able to dissociate the trauma is the whole reason they want you. But then also because that allows you to then internally play the same role as the handlers, to where those parts that are convinced to play that role are then able to, in the same way, when you, like I had mentioned before, if the team notices that we're thinking about things we're not supposed to, or enact like moving towards a life plan that we're not supposed to, different things like that, like that you'll experience, body memories, you'll experience essentially programming that's punishment programming that pulls up essentially these parts out of whatever location it is in your system, to almost pulls them out of their little memory box into the torture dungeon so that you re-experience that that trauma, that torture, that fear sometimes is all they want you to just experience, the emotion of or depression. It's like you can take someone's energy and sap it real quick with a little bit of fear and depression. You know what I mean? So it's like the way that they create these few places for real, but then intentionally have you internalize them essentially so that they are so that they're a part of your system and a part of the control system. So on the left there, what you're going to be seeing is what was kind of like the result of all this programming, like how the cult side of my system was structured, basically, where in the top location in the red is the pleasure palace. That's like where the part that had the relationship with Gates and saw themselves as having like an NWO occult hierarchy role lived, essentially, and it was 100% dissociated, like almost had no awareness of all the other stuff. So all you had, was you know, this was the part for me that played my front role most often, and was, fun and charming and silly and all this other stuff, but also the personality Gates wanted, and was meant to create a mask of not having difficult emotions, But that was a lot because, through programming, they're dissociated from all the pain. It's essentially a palace that's built on top of, as you can see there, a much bigger, much darker thing, which was essentially, if you want to show the other, and the little balcony we'll show real quick. So the part of me that was conscious, do you see that tiny like balcony off to the left? Yes. So basically, like the part of me that was most of my life, this was like how I, I saw myself. Like when I couldn't describe it other than I felt like I was locked in the top room of a tower. This my conscious self, this is how I described it, throughout my whole life. Is I felt like I was locked on the top room of a tower in a single room, and I couldn't, I knew there was other shit going on, but I just couldn't get beyond the locked door. You know what I mean? The only thing I could see, is I could go out to my balcony and just see like a land of fucking horror, essentially. And that was like the only, that was my life. That was suicidal ideation. My whole life was like this idea of escape. If I could just get up the courage to jump off that fucking it's like that was like, but that was like internally like how they had created a lot of things to for me to see the only form of escape basically, and to see myself, as very cooped up and locked up, consciously essentially. And then there was all this other shit that was going on, behind the scenes, but my daytime self felt like it occupied that much space. You know what I mean? Like, so and that's why I wanted to bring that little bit up, it's just to show that it's like, when you're dealing with this level of like programming monarch stuff, is like they really want to like isolate and contain as much of like your true self, you know what I mean, as possible, and try and have all the rest of you fucking programmed as much as possible. um and then I guess we could go to the other picture unless you have any um questions there. I think it's the green and
Yes. I just want to comment and say, like, again, trying to conceptualize some of this can be very difficult because those of us who haven't been through this, like, we don't, at least me, I don't have anything inside that like has some sort of like a visual attached to it or like a location, you know what I
yeah.
mean? So trying to conceptualize something like this too is very difficult for people. And this is really helpful to provide something like this where we sort of get an insight into what something looks like inside that a lot of us don't have or have never experienced, and it blows my mind what they're able to program inside
Yeah.
of a human that, like it's literally almost like a software program, like what you'd see in a computer, or a video game, a scene, a setting with characters in it and all these different systems, all of these different like locations in a sense that they create. And like you said, they do it on the outside. There's like, you know, a freaking Hollywood movie set that they're providing
Mm-hmm.
a physical thing, and then they're doing the same thing internally. So it's so blended, and to me, it just blows my mind that like so many people, including myself, have never known that our bodies are even capable of doing this, So again, it's really mind-blowing and very insightful to like learn this. And it almost like leaves me speechless sometimes because I'm just like, how is this just left out of everything? Like that we're capable of literally having a world inside of us, in certain circumstances, like how you were raised, and going through what you did. And it's just not talked about, and it's such a shame because if people like really understood, they'd be mesmerized by what our bodies are capable of, but there'd also be like just this outpouring of empathy, I feel, of being able to um not gaslight survivors and invite these conversations in and have an understanding of what's possible versus it just being written off totally. Like we miss out on so many opportunities, whether it's from a therapist or a pastor, a friend, to have an understanding of this, and it makes me really sad that we lack the ability of comprehending this as a society, that like I'm 38 years old and like just experiencing this stuff for like the first time and like seeing something like this from you, it's just it's it's amazing because we have people like you now coming out and educating us, but it really it and it makes me speechless, you know, like I don't really have words for how it makes me feel. Like it makes me mad and upset that like we're just so neglectful of this, you know, when this is like your entire life, like you lived all of this. And then on the outside, you have people telling you that, not you necessarily, but we have people saying that this kind of stuff is crazy, that it's fake, it's not taught in academia, you know, and it's like, holy shit, like you said, if you listen to enough testimonies, you get the corroborating stories and testimony, like it's 100% true. And it's fascinating, it's amazing, it's horrifying, it's harrowing, it's takes your breath away, you know, but um it's amazing that you're able to provide these visuals, you know, so that's my long-winded way of saying thank you. um it's really helpful to be able to understand this, you know. To me it feels like going to school, you know, listening to you and like watching all of this. It's like I'm relearning about what my body is capable of, what your body is capable of, you know, what's possible, and, you know, sort of like getting insight into stuff that's like so hard to understand.
Definitely. And I just appreciate you sharing that as always, because I do always feel like I don't know, it gives me more insight into what I'm hoping to do, too. It's just like it's that I don't know. I just felt like I'm like there's gotta be a reason I've done this much healing and I'm like willing to talk about it, I guess. It's like if it is helpful to anyone, like but and that is what I feel encouraged about, is that the visuals are helping people to conceptualize all of this in a way that they haven't been able to before when it's just words on paper or someone just saying it with their voice. Um,
Right.
so this is kind of like more programming stuff. So this is kind of like how I would have left um how I left Texas basically. This is a portrait of me in college. But still the parts were in existence, when I left Texas. Is like at that point I had mentioned I had around the time my brother being born, that was when I had a lot of this shit going on, and I was flown to Washington D.C. for a ritual with Gates, essentially. That was the one that had like the near death experience in during, but there was a lot of royalty programming there too. Like so during like the day to day time of like being in Washington D.C., we were just there a couple of days, basically around the time of the ritual that I had mentioned before. But essentially, like that part was given, that kind of like how you had seen before. There was the Red Palace, so there was the part that had the relationship with him, but there was also like a corresponding like a purely occult like ritual hierarchy, kind of royalty part. And that was typically the part that was brought along to rituals as well. But essentially, we were given the experience of like, it was a really nice condo, in Washington, D.C. There was an older Black woman there and a young Latina girl. She's probably like a maybe like 6-year-old Black woman. And then it was a young Latina girl that was probably maybe 13 or so, and they were in just installments in that condo basically. Like so and so the older woman was essentially there to like take care of me and the other girl, but the other girl, like they were there to essentially be my servants essentially. So like I was being abused by Gates, but then anytime I was there in the condo, or they even took me out to like the museum like one day, it's like I was like a spoiled little rich girl, which is complete opposite how I typically was. But that's essentially how, 6 years old, when I was quote unquote graduating my occult training, and this is like the main part that had like the occult hierarchy role and kind of ran that Black Castle that you had seen. That essentially, that part had kind of embraced that, had embraced the ideology, had, that's why they were playing the role of, you know, helping to keep that castle intact and to enact the punishment programming. You know what I mean? Like all of that stuff is because there was a part of me that had not realized, had gone through a lot of trauma and didn't realize really, that we had a choice essentially, in things, and felt like our daytime self was kind of saw our daytime self as, that was like our nighttime self basically, but our daytime self, she saw it as weak, ineffectual, almost like the way that the Illuminati type people see all the other people, essentially, like that is how that half of my system, saw my daytime self. They saw me as a helpless little girl, you know what I mean? And then there was this other part of me that felt like it had complete awareness of what was going on and total resentment. Also, there was resentment but also jealousy, and that's kind of like what you're seeing there, is that like pro survivors will talk a lot often sometimes about mirrors, and two-way mirrors and one-way mirrors and stuff in the system programming. So that's kind of how things worked for me. Like the part that was in control of maintaining that whole castle structure had, from the subconscious, complete awareness of like the role of the programming, but because ideologically she was in line, didn't didn't have an issue with it, saw it as something that made us stronger, that gave us our place, in the world and our self-esteem and all of that kind of stuff. So it's almost like when we were like there, it's like us looking in a mirror, like literally. And it was kind of like how I saw myself in college, that it was like my normal self is in the green, essentially, and just um doesn't see anything basically, like just sees a mirror, so I would just see essentially my own reflection reflected back to me, but on the black side, from that part of the system. Because you were saying, there's like an internal world, and it's almost like if you've dealt with monarch stuff, sometimes you'll have multiple worlds, that are almost like stacked on top of each other, because there's, that is part of how they create the layering in your system, so that you have, backups to where hopefully, you don't get to the most sensitive information as their goal, that you'll just get stuck on the incest and you'll never, you'll never make it past that, basically, to deal with all the other stuff that's fucking you up from your subconscious, like Svali's talked about many times. But essentially, like, so for her, she could see my whole life, basically, and, our whole life, that is me, like from that perspective, I could see my whole life, from the subconscious, what it felt like from watching behind the scenes, and directing things. It felt like she could see my whole life, I could see my whole life, but the perspective was that it was sad, like the part I was kept so small, especially socially and stuff like that, is very isolated and everything as like a kid, that those parts, being able to converse not just with people, but with people of quote unquote power and influence, and to be like, feel like you belong essentially there. It's like it felt like a total, she it felt easy to value that role, you know what I mean, in your own system, because it came along with, like other survivors have talked about, many, many quote unquote rewards or benefits, that your daytime self just didn't ever have the experience of, basically. But ultimately, what I want to share with survivors, in my experience, is like, even though there was like in a lot of antagonism, especially throughout my life and then earlier on in healing, is that what I've come to find is that she held a very resentful role, essentially, is that like, it's kind of like the closest I can like when I think of a lot of the cult allied parts, the closest I can give an analogy to is if you've seen like Hercules, we're familiar with like, Hades and stuff like that. But essentially it was like, it's like the same interaction between Zeus and Hades, where it's like Hades is just pissed that, like, you know, ultimately, that the other, his brother was chosen to, rule the land of the living, and he has to fucking rule the land of the dead. And that ultimately, that my cult parts, once we've gotten to a place of healing them, initially there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of attachment to those roles and all that stuff. But once you finally get through to them, what you'll tend to find, is that they're just young kid parts that only wanted to be that too, and are on a certain level, it's like they do want to heal. They are unhappy with the fact that they've been put in charge of the land of the dead, you know what I mean? And causing pain and causing suffering, causing all this stuff, especially when you can start, showing them how inaccurate and wrong, the ideologies, that they had been taught with were, when they had such limited, um, understanding. So I'll just finish explaining what's going on here, and then I'm going to talk about the Mistress Diana memory real quick that like I keep forgetting to talk about. So feel free to remind me if I forget. But essentially, what you're seeing here is like kind of like this is a cult. Like after the occult graduation, this was like what the roles I continue to play in rituals moving forward. And it was like I had said, I had a long-term consort slash sex magic gig with my dad's ex, my dad's boss, John Madden, the hand surgeon, and his wife, basically. But there was an additional, kind of bigger ritual that I went to sometimes once a year, but it wasn't always that I was the one playing the role. That essentially it was a very, what they saw as a very important role in the occult hierarchy, basically, and it occurred on the Childermass. I don't know if anyone knows what that is. It's December 27th. It's the I was gonna say uh um it's the ritual where they or sorry, it's I'll talk about what the Christian significance is and why it is like a big ritual for like Druidic and Illuminati and Satanic people. Is that it basically is massacre of the innocents in biblical understanding. So that Jesus was essentially, they attempted to kill him, because the ruler at the time had like a sage that had told him that he was going to be, overthrown essentially by, a child born in, I can't remember, it was Bethlehem or where it was, but basically, Mary was alerted by the angel, and they escaped. But essentially, that's like it's known as, the murder, the massacre of the innocents. Basically, it was like a whole like town or county or something like that. Where around, I think that around the time that Jesus was like one or so, that and there's historical documentation of this too. That the whole town was like murdered, basically. Like they murdered any male baby under the age of two, basically two and under. So it's like, it's a Christian holiday, basically, that's like there to like, honor, the fact that there was, this murder of the innocents, but then it's also a dark occult holiday because it's obviously centered around babies dying, you know what I mean? So so essentially that is when I would have like, it was kind of seen as like, my highest honor in like the occult, was that I would perform this ritual that was called the consecration of the newborn, basically, which was that if there was a new occult uh um birth, basically, like so there was a baby that was born in the area that was going to be, consecrated as part of like the whole, chain of stuff, that essentially they would bring the baby and we would do like a mock sacrifice basically on that baby, and an actual sacrifice on a baby that they parents usually brought as like the proxy for. But it was very intentional, like it was very intentional, the traumatization basically, of their baby as well, with the blood of the baby that actually was killed and all this stuff. It was very intentional, like them, you know newborn, very much traumatizing them. There's some pricking of the feet and stuff like that, but for the most part, it's seen as like I said, they value their bloodlines a lot, and at this point they decide they don't want to sacrifice them as much, so that's why they're allowed to bring a proxy, essentially, another baby to essentially, you know for that to occur essentially at the ritual. And then what you see, so that's the bottom scene there, with like the altar, and that would have and then above it is like it was always a two-part ritual. So the one I had mentioned that happened, I'm pretty sure under Capitol Hill, and oh, I did say Washington Monument when I mentioned that ritual last time under Capitol Hill area. And it's Lincoln Monument that I meant when it was like a seated figure on like a throne, basically. So that's kind of more. I think I said Washington Monument, which is not what I meant. I digress. But regardless, so in that one I had mentioned, being like wrapped up essentially in like the gauze and everything like that, and being blindfolded and everything, because usually your eyes are like in my experiences, like my eyes wouldn't blink essentially, they would roll like when the trance state, it's like they would kind of like roll back and like not blink, and they would put this like moistened like whatchamacallit, blindfold essentially over. So essentially after that initial consecration ritual, they would put some of it, always came back to the same, that initial ritual, it was a mix of blood and water, where they would put some of the blood from the sacrifice or sacrifices in some water, and then the two acolytes, it would hold my head under the water until like this trance state was like induced essentially, and then I would be essentially, kind of like wrapped in a big white robe, and then sat on this throne essentially, where very similar to that initial one, like I'd mentioned when I was very young in Washington D.C., people would proceed to like come up and like ask me questions essentially. It typically wasn't my stuff, like I've mentioned before, it wasn't typically like about future prediction or anything like that. I typically felt like it was fortunately like a channeling type experience or something, where it was more that I was giving information about current things essentially, and insight into like current situations. So people would be asking me about stupid shit about business or about whatever, you know what I mean? Like just very whatever issue it was, if they had given a sacrifice, in the ritual, then they were then entitled to essentially have like some, direction in their life or something from this part. Um so and that's pretty much like what like I'm going to talk about the last Mistress Diana memory next, but this is kind of like the like I don't know how to describe it. It's like kind of like the pinnacle of like the occult programming, for them. It was, it was like I was saying, was a lot of why the whole choice of me to have the quote unquote entity attachments and all that kind of stuff was a lot of why, I was also chosen to have the NWO training and all that different stuff, was because, it's like you had proven your worthiness or whatever, you know what I mean? And these really fucked up circles by surviving insane stuff, I guess. But that I was gonna say that like this was pretty much like, I don't know how to describe it. It's like what all the torture I went through was like kind of like geared towards like my highest purpose, for them essentially, was this like occult role essentially, and because they are stupid and psychopaths and they want this shit performed by, what they want, I guess, you know what I mean? Because I'm like, if they just wanted a psychopath, you could just have a fucking psychopath like do that, you know what I mean? I think a lot of times with like Nathan Reynolds and his like testimony where he talks about, walking in on the ritual and that he wasn't able, to stop or different stuff like that, or at the party, and it's like for the most part, I think like most of those people choose to be there 100%, but it is something that's always like stuck with me too, to be like, it's like, what would I have thought, if I would have walked in on myself, to see yourself in these roles, it's like, and to know that God knows you and knows that you would have never like, that it took a lot to get you to be this thing, you know what I mean? But who knows? I mean, I think that's why they call us like chosen ones or something, is because they, for better or worse, they choose, they choose us and they do a lot of shit to us, So, but that's one thing that I can firmly say is that, like, maybe those parts of the time would have chosen they were to be there, but it was only because they were working on insanely limited, insanely limited knowledge, and even her, like I said, like this part of me that felt like we had pure understanding of like our whole life, because this part of me felt like I could see both like the nighttime side of things and the daytime side of things. What we were still missing was, a connection to our heart, essentially. This part had been programmed and convinced, kind of like the unicorn, that it had been stolen from her, that it was something that she didn't have access to. So it was a literal, psychopath mentality, essentially, So yeah, it's like in those moments, it's like if you would have asked that part if they wanted to be there, like they probably would have said yes, until that wasn't the case, unfortunately, until that wasn't, the case, but if I was snapped out of that dissociative trance, you know what I mean? It's like, fuck no, you better believe I'd be freaking the fuck out, which did happen in, in college shortly after, like kind of like what you're seeing here, is like when my shutdown programming happened, it was because I, was in the middle of a ritual in college, essentially, and had, you know, I I had a moment, God moment, a moment where the victim, the eye contact, was able to get through to me, and I snapped out of the program, and I immediately saw like what I was doing, essentially, and just it's like I wasn't even able really to like stop my hell self and comprehend it, because it was just followed with like an immediate flood of like all that dungeon shit we just talked about. It's like if you start breaking, like disobeying or breaking stuff, in my experience, it's like I just started screaming like my face was on fire, basically, for the last ritual before they shut me down, because um I think I had talked about it on here before, but it's like I had an experience in the bunker and around the same graduation time, 6, 7 years old, where the part that had the relationship with Gates, had at least one experience that solidified why it was we could never deviate, and that's why I talked about my trigger with acid, was that there was a girl that was, essentially, tortured to death, in front of us, like via like pouring acid on her, but they kind of like I had mentioned before, the bunker, is like they're simultaneously also, burning me with a very diluted acid type solution, and creating, so it's like you're seeing it, you're hearing it, you're also having some physical sensations that are reminiscent. And that was a lot of my, that was what got enacted during my last, ritual in college, before, like I said, they tapped me for this Hapsburg unicorn stuff, in the cruise in 2014, um, and Paris in 2015, that like, I saw myself in a moment with the eyes of God, and I did not want to be doing, you know what I mean? It's like, but I didn't even have a chance to really think with my free will for more than a second before there was, like I said, this flood of just like, feeling like my face was being melted off by acid, and just like, like fucking screaming and freaking falling to the ground and shit like that. And then being like rushed off from the ritual and being like fucking bundled in the back of a car, and then having Gates and my, his assistant, you know what I mean? Just, berating me, trying to do what they could to ones, to shut me down, because when it's like that wasn't working, getting rushed off to Davis Monthan, to have like some electron, they're inducing some stuff to essentially basically like he was just pissed, really, because I had embarrassed him, and he just wanted me like just fucking like he had already been having issues with me trying to break out of my programming in college, and just being promiscuous and did a lot of things that I wasn't supposed to be doing, and it was kind of the last straw for him because I'd embarrassed him so much in a ritual, and like they did a lot that night, like in the programming room, just to kind of like shut things down, to essentially ensure that my goal was to, my future was just to be a burnout, fucking alcoholic artist basically. And they don't really, I don't think the intention was that I would go and kill myself or anything, because I think they always hope that they can use you, and again. But, it's like it was pretty much trying to shut down all of the shit, because it had been becoming problematic anyway. I wasn't behaving the way I was supposed to. And ultimately these people are cowards and bullies and stuff. And if like they experience too much fight and difficulty, they get bored and they move on, to an easier victim, basically. So yeah, I'm gonna take a drink before I talk about the Mistress Diana stuff. But I mean, are we still doing good on time and stuff? I'm
Yeah,
no.
absolutely. And that visual went perfect with the picture before because we got to see sort of like a visual of an internal system that, because that comes up once in a while. People will talk about that. And it's like, okay, well, I can sort of understand what that is, but like, what does that look like? What does it, how does it visualized inside of a person? How does it exist? And then on the next slide, the one that we just had, we got to see sort of that double life and that a little bit of that hierarchy of the roles that are played in these. And I think again, it's so mind-boggling to think that like our consciousness can not only split, but that they can all be so intelligent and that certain ones have knowledge of certain things, that there can be, like you said, teams working together. I've heard that from another survivor that was saying, I can be just like living my daily life, like going to work, and in the background, there's, a basically like a team working and they're researching or putting together a presentation or like working on something internally. And then they'll present it to me later on when I have time to like listen to them. And I'm just like, holy shit, like that's insane that like that can just be happening. It's hard enough, like I feel, to have one consciousness and like to manage that going to work and, living a daily life and whatever else. And I think about like having a team of, sometimes hundreds of different splits working together, different parts that are working together or working against each other, and then trying to manage that as that front personality and being like, all right, you guys, let's come together and like work together, and let me get to know all of you and, see how we can communicate and trust each other and get on the same page. Like, I mean, it's incredible that you're not only able to understand this, but explain it in such detail and in such a concise way. And then to see like, that's a product of the work that you've done that you're not teaching us, like you did all that work inside of you, and that's why you're able to teach it to us, and I think that ultimately, hopefully that gives hope to people on the other side too, that, are struggling with that or just waking up, that like that's possible. You can see these photos and see like a conflict maybe, or um a dialogue that's not happening. Like how you said, the one part that lived in the top of the castle had an awareness of the system that some of the parts below didn't, but
Mhm.
we're able to eventually come to a leveling point, and get everybody sort of on the same page to see what's going on and to communicate, so it's really amazing the work that you've done, Carrie, like it's incredible that you've been able to come so far in your journey, and in such a short amount of time, and like to be able to educate us now on it. It's amazing.
Thank you. I mean, the healing, like the only reason I have any of it, is obviously just because I was just trying to heal, just most of the time, anything you're seeing that's like a watercolor journal is something that I've dealt with in a time of flashback, so if I'm journaling about something, it's usually because I was in a complete panic attack and dealing with, all the shit that a lot of survivors experience, when you're dealing with flooding and, triggers and shit coming up, it's like when you're processing it, it gets worse before it gets better, you know. So really, all of my journaling techniques, everything I do is it's just, to get my head right. And for me, the visual stuff really has been that like so many of these parts are so young is that they don't really feel validated and understood, by the rest of the system and stuff like that, especially for writing with words, and it's like if you can just, that's what creates, the peace for me a lot of times is you have to find a way to externalize it in whatever way. For me, it's been visual journals, but it's also that's why I'm just so grateful because it does feel like I've done a shit ton of work, and just in and of itself, it's like the healing, the presence in my life, all of this stuff, is like, can't even compare, to I would never trade it in. You know what I mean? I would never go back to the other side, even knowing how difficult it's been to get here. But also knowing now that like I can share it with people, excuse me, and that actually is going to be, lending some understanding both to allies and survivors, I think is, it makes it feel that much more worth it and really does come back to what, feels like part of, my purpose here, on Earth is that like um, I just want to help people out of the spot, that I know that I was in, which is, it's one thing to go through all this shit, you know what I mean? Like that never gets easier, but what can get easier is like, the fact, like how we live our day-to-day life, and how we can learn to like heal and love ourselves and, and feel, just all the good, that comes with healing on the other side of the very horrible shit that I have to put on paper, So, um, yeah, but I guess like this memory, I I had mentioned to you that I had wanted to bring it up a couple of times, and I always managed to forget about it, which is why I'm bringing it up today. And I did not include the journal entry that went along with it because it just looks like colors to me because some things are less figurative or recognizable than others. Sometimes things are a little bit more loose, basically, and that was one of them. So maybe I should have included it, but I didn't. So sorry, guys. But essentially, it was another Mistress Diana event. Happened in the bunker. Like I said, pretty much all this stuff we've been talking about with this particular training, all this stuff was 5, 6, 7 for the most part. So I can visualize age. This I moved to Tucson was like 7.5. So um, essentially, like the main reason I wanted to bring up this memory is because it's kind of like, to me, the foundation of like all of, you know, the ability to dissociate what you're doing in a ritual, basically. Like, like that essentially, like, yeah, we've talked about it a bunch, obviously. It's like, yeah, you're in a dissociated state. You're in a, but what what beliefs did that part have to go through to then be able to play that role? You know what I mean? Like, so, and that's like what I constantly come back to is like understanding the amount of work that these abusers have to put in to try and make us like them, and it still doesn't fucking work. But essentially, this was like actually a rare daytime memory that occurred during the bunker time, basically. Not the bunker time, the kennel time. Some of that time was spent in the bunker, but regardless, um, this particular spot was at the kennel. Like I said, typically I'd be there a lot of times kept in a cage in between the training events or stuff like that. It was always came back to in between training events, like my house, my home was my kennel. It was a stainless steel box, that was um, like an indoor, pretend outdoor area, so I had fake grass in the, I think it was like a boarding facility, veterinary facility that was pretty rural, that like, but pretty big that we were at essentially. The boys were always kept in like the outdoor kennels with like the dogs, but that was like a lot of like, so the royalty program was that I got the clean stainless steel one on the inside, you know what I mean, and all this shit. But that part of me viewed that as home, saw it as someplace safe. Because if I was there, I wasn't getting fucking abused. You know what I mean? Like it's like there was all that. So essentially it was being, pulled out to um it was being pulled out for it was during the daytime essentially. And I was taken with Gates and Mistress Diana to it was like a nearby like a camping site. Basically, it just looked like it had like a picnic bench on like a little concrete pad and a call it like a barbecue grill, you know what I mean? Other than that, it was pretty just like what I remember from a lot of areas, like kind of sparsely wooded, like pretty open. But in any case, we were brought out there, and they brought a dog with us, too. So it's like initially, it's like I was in the kennel, I was in a kennel, and there was a dog in a kennel, basically, typically like a black metal crate, It was brought out to this campsite essentially, and they proceeded to pull me out, and Mistress Diana was the main one there, like kind of like teaching me, for the event, and that essentially um, she basically had told Gates that at the hunting party that I wasn't as like enthusiastic, as I should have been. Basically about like, the whole butchery stuff and everything. And he's like, so, and he wanted me to like, prove that like I like had like, you know, dealt with my shit. But also this is just a programming thing because they knew I hadn't dealt with my shit, basically, so they knew that there was going to be an issue, and that there was going to be the following scenario. But that essentially, that so she puts a knife in my hand, and it's like, kill the dog, basically. And I was like, no, I don't want to kill the dog, and she's like, they say, kill the dog, and I won't kill the dog, And essentially what she does is she takes a knife back from me, and then Gates proceeds to pour lighter fluid all over the dog and then set the dog on fire, and let the dog, kind of ran around the clearing, stuff like that. Um, and then it's like we were instructed to go, you know, she instructed me to go get it basically once the dog had like had kind of had stopped running. Essentially, we went over to it, caught up with it basically. And she essentially, it's like you have a dog that's almost dead essentially, and is horribly hurt. And I basically was brought over to the dog, and the knife was put in my hand, and they're like, kill the dog, basically. And basically, she looked at me and she said, death is a mercy, basically, that things can always be worse, and that was like that little mantra there, death is a mercy, things can always be worse, is basically like, the um, what would be, what was at the basis, of those parts that perform the rituals and stuff like that, is like you had seen so many babies die and people die in so many horrible ways, is that in that part in the back of their head, like there was this idea that they were, especially if you were quick about it, that it was a mercy, that this baby could be going through way worse things, you know what I mean? That like, and probably would essentially if like, we didn't do what we were expected to do, essentially, Um, and so, I mean, that's the main reason it's like I'd mentioned that I hadn't mentioned this memory before, but I had been wanting to bring up for several times, because it's, it makes me want to cry too, because I mean, all of these do, it makes me sad, but it makes me really sad to like know that like the perpetrator allied parts or, that this is what, it's like we, as a front just judged and judged and judged, and to know that like at the bottom of it it's like a 6-year-old that like had like a charred dog in front of him, and like how important, how impactful that was, to just really like illustrate to you that you had no control over the situation. There's no saving, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, you could choose not to kill him, but something worse is going to happen, you know what I mean? Like that it was just all of that, and that was like that was the basis of like all the occult ritual butcher, all that shit, you know what I mean? It is there was this idea, that not only was death a mercy, but that we were also playing, that there was some bigger plan for it all, that it was all that there, because of the whole, you know, protecting Mother Earth as our ultimate, that ultimate idea of their religion and all this stuff, you know what I mean? That there was this idea that it wasn't just that death was a mercy, and all this stuff for the person or animal that we were with. It was also the idea that we were also saving others. I think this, you know what I mean? And that was like a total mind fuck, this idea that we were like performing this ritual a la, harvest festivals or shit like that. Like, but if we just do this, then next year we're gonna have enough food to feed everyone, like no, you know what I mean? Like that's not how you should do things. But that's, that was the basis of all of my occult shit, and that's what you have to work your way through to understand, and that's why, I brought that episode with the whole demons thing and stuff, is in my experience, I have yet to encounter anything in my system, and I will say I do believe in outside entities and attachments and stuff like that for sure. But I don't personally believe that we as survivors are possessed. I don't. Like I do feel like maybe we have attachments, that we can shed essentially, but I don't think that like but that is instantly shed in my experience as soon as you revoke consent basically, and that is like 100%. Like all you need to do with this stuff is like once you can show the part, like the shit that they went through, and once they can be understood, then that consent in my experience is like, they turn towards God, they turn towards Jesus, they turn towards, you know love and compassion and stuff, and they turn away from those old belief systems because they are very obviously, very tainted and very untrue, and they're just untrue.
Oh my goodness. Trying to just like contend with that is so heavy, like it's so sad. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Um, all of it. But it's like it really is sick that like they essentially train you to think that like killing something on the spot is like the best option. And that,
Yeah.
it's like if you don't do that, it's just going to prolong it. Like it's going to happen anyways. It's just going to happen in a way that's like going to be probably longer and more painful and like really, really horrifying to watch. It's like they train you to like be automatic with those cues that like if they tell you to do something like that, that you'll do it with the understanding that like you said, death is a freaking mercy. Like you're doing it a favor if you don't do it.
No point in resisting.
Right. Yeah. It's just like I can't. How old were you during that? Did you say you were 7?
Say,
Oh my gosh. That's hard for me to even
um
like try to
yeah.
comprehend now. I can't comprehend it. Like that was the weight that was on your shoulder at freaking like 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. Like just oh my God, Carrie. Just it's so fucking sad. I'm so sorry that you had to go through all of that. Like I can't imagine trying to make those decisions and like having adults that should have been protecting you, putting you in those positions. It's terrifying, horrifying. It's awful. It's evil. It's just evil.
It's really, I mean it is, that's, there's no other words for it for sure. And it's like, it's a, I feel like it is a, you know I don't know. I've said it from the beginning, it feels like the only thing I can do for the victims, is tell their story, and that is including my own, self and everything like that, is that like at least there's like some acknowledgement of the suffering they went through, and hopefully there's like a purpose to it, that it obviously isn't the abusers, but that's like what I've come to find in my own understanding with God and stuff like that, is that, you know, dissociation is there to keep us from the most intense experiences, you know what I mean? And that like on a certain level that, not everyone's ready to hear this, or feels the same way, but that I feel like on a certain level that we've all chosen our life path, animals included, before we come in, to this world, that we choose to play a role. I also feel like it's possible that some of these are negatively charged souls sometimes too. I don't really know how some things like that work, but it feels like for the most part, that it's like that we 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 come in with full knowing essentially of what we're going to go through, and that ultimately I see everything as leading towards a more beautiful future. It's it's like we can't have no suffering, without an absence of free will. And that's like, that is God's love for us, is that he wants us to choose to be good. It's like, I am grateful that I made it past my last birthday and was able to see and heal all of these parts of myself. I would have felt incredibly heartbroken if I would have, like, you know, been on the other side, like past and then gotten to meet the rest of myself, like it would have been so sad, like, and that's like what I feel like I've been, granted in healing, is being able to like finally like, you know, have all of those parts like acknowledged and everything, and understood and everything, and seen like the way God sees us, which is that, that we're valid and we were just trying to survive. And that ultimately, like, if we can take our suffering as humans and put it towards a like others, in a more important cause and something, then it's like, that's, I don't know, it's like kind of the biggest thing we could ask for. So, um, but
I think you definitely did mention Mistress Diana before. How was she, I guess, related to your situation? Was she somebody that Gates was affiliated with, or your father? How did she sort of like get put in the mix of
so
all this?
the most that I have an understanding of is that she was definitely part of, like a coven type thing. In the first ritual where I was like, kind of like, or the first ritual in Texas, basically, she was like, that was when I had first met her, essentially, because she was one of the women who came and like spoke to me essentially, when I thought I was like dying and stuff, and uh, like was kind of trauma bonded to me then, essentially, and then was later on played like this handler role as far as like teaching me the occult stuff. But from my understanding, I feel like she was me, but like maybe like 10 years, or no, because she's probably about like 14 years older. So essentially it seemed like she had all the identical training as I did, to where she had probably been one of Gates's earlier, pretty much me, but 15 years prior, and was then in the role of now doing this, it's the same training that she had herself gone through, basically, is how I've come to understand and interpret it. It's like she was like most of the programmers and stuff like that, where some of them are psychopaths or knowledgeable, but some of them are going to be like Smalley, are going to be people, we're gray, we're going to be people that like were trained to do these things, but we're just like me in the occult ritual. We're in a place of not understanding the reality of what they were doing to other people. So she, that was, I think, my ultimate, like the ultimate goal for me was that like in college that I was going to begin training, the next generation as well. I don't think I got to that, like I said, because it's like I had my like breakdown and everything like that. I'm pretty sure it was like my sophomore year of college, basically. And then I was just ignored for a few years, essentially. But um, yeah, I mean, I think that is the total intention, for sure. And I had mentioned her before with the hunting event, and I think on the Redeeming Demons episode, so that was the one with the little boy and the training event that she was, same thing, where and if you listen to her name too, you'll understand like why, if you understand mythology. Like, so my archetype typically that I went with was Artemis, but there were a couple other goddesses I was also like attached to or whatever, typically all had roughly the same archetypes, so where they're combined with like fertility, but not from a mothering side, more like the sexual side of things, and then the violence or war slash huntress kind of stuff. But Mistress Diana, is like, so her programming name, is Diana. It's the same as Artemis, basically. It's the moon, another, huntress, moon goddess. So that's part of why it is also, my hunch based off of all my memories with her and her name, that she was, that I was considered like, in the same lineage, in this, went through the same programming, all that kind of stuff. She, I think, tended to play the same role in the ritual she was in, as far as the archetype and stuff. So, because that's what she was trained in. So, but like I said, there was the crossover too, where she was also trained in this sexual sadism, and then also from like the diplomacy etiquette side of things, too, to where, so it was like multiple layers that she had, and that was the same as mine, and took over a lot of the training events with Gates, basically.
Thank you for explaining that. It's also, seeing how vast these networks are and like the connections of how people know each other, like what their roles are. That's also like really mind-blowing because like you said, there's so many years of training and time and energy and money, and you see like how somebody like Gates, like he's an old man now and he never left. Like he's consciously like choosing to like just be who he is, and that's what it is. And he's never come out the other side like you did. And you think about how many years of somebody's life that goes into grooming somebody to become that, and it's terrifying that it works, that not everybody
Yeah.
does come out and is resistant to it like you. That some people, it's like they're eager to grow and they're motivated by it, and one day eventually choose it consciously. So it's really
Yeah.
wild. And I mean, incredible that you somehow like always just defied it. You'd never like, you were unbreakable, your spirit never broke like theirs did, and no matter how hard they tried, and they did, you didn't become that role. You broke that generational trauma when they spent so much time grooming you for it, and all these different
Yeah.
people in your life that they installed to ensure that you would take that role over, and like you still didn't. Like,
Mm-hmm.
amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I keep bringing up with like my last birthday, basically, is that a lot of survivors that have very structured programming will have like a lot of, they give you long-term plans for your life and everything that, from the subconscious you follow and everything. And that was like very much the intention with all of my programming, is that they wanted to build up this cult side of myself that was big enough to where if I didn't consciously choose to be a psychopath somewhere along the way, is there was enough programming there to essentially keep me playing that role from an amnesic side of things. They kind of don't care either way, as long as you're still doing the job that they want. It's like if you're doing it because you're aware or because you're unaware, I feel like they don't care that much. So, and that was my, for me, my last birthday, was that it was intentional for me that in my system that essentially all those parts that had been on the occult side of things, basically, like, so that black, all that kind of stuff, they had all been essentially they had all been told by programmers, and it had been reinforced on the cruise and that whole contract signing shit, that they just had to wait. That they just had to wait, essentially, and then all their dreams would come true. That there would be this intentional like choosing to switch in a system, like, but that it was also facilitated by all this like intentional programming timing stuff, where we would choose ourselves to sacrifice, to subjugate our true selves, and that this other half of the system that had been essentially waiting for permission to take over could finally take over. And what the intention was, so this is a contract I was signing back in 2014, and we are 10 years later, we're in 2024 now, you know what I mean? It was basically this understanding that I had a decade, I had basically had a decade that I was going to be living this front life that of, tattoo artist and all this different stuff. And because that was already the spot that I was in at that time in 2014. And that at, this birthday is, when I would essentially consciously, shift, to where these parts would be in control, but not from not just from the subconscious, but also from the consciousness. And that almost like all a get out, you know what I mean? And there's like this sunken place that my true self, would be almost like subsumed beneath, all of this huge amount of programming and all these other parts that they had created, basically. And what would then happen, was that I would leave my current partner. I would, because at the time they didn't really care who it was. At the time I was with my partner I am now, Billy. He's my husband. I love him to death. He's like, I mean, he's the reason I'm here, to be honest. He's the reason I healed, and everything. Like many people have talked about, having, um, you know, the love in your life is a lot of times a huge part of being able to break free of stuff, um, having that support and everything. But so during the cruise event, there was a lot of blackmail that was used against like me to like both, ensure that I would be promised, a different partner for the whole parts that felt like they wanted money and all the shit that we had been bribed with, basically. So there was this idea that, 2024 would roll around, and by my birthday, the expectation was that I would have a kid or two at that point, and the goal was that I would essentially leave my partner. I would, out of nowhere, is like you have all these different crazy things coming up when you're dealing with timed programming and stuff like that, because you have almost like parts that have been asleep for a very long time that are suddenly activated, and you're having to deal with all of these, thoughts and programming and shit. So it's a lot of crap to heal. But on the other side of it, you have, way less amnesia, way less triggers, way less of these cult allied, perpetrator parts, that you have to struggle with on a day-to-day basis, like when it comes to your internal world. But essentially, that's what I was promised. I would leave my partner, I would bring my kids, I would be a single mom for a short amount of time, and then I would be quickly picked up by essentially a new wealthy spouse that would essentially take me under his wing and propel my art career, my official art career, because I've always been technically trained, as a painter and stuff like that. Propel me into like celebrity status, because it all comes back to like the Tavistock type stuff. Like if you look at my artwork when I came back from Paris, like it was obsessive. Like all I was doing was like the goddess shit. But it was always very violent. It was always very dark and like super sexual. You know what I mean? Like, but it was ultimately, I mean, it's pushing the archetype and the narrative that they want nowadays anyway. Like not a good goddess archetype, but it like kind of like a negative, violent, Baphomet, kind of shit, basically. And that, so essentially subconsciously, I was creating a body of work, this front self, and everything that would lend itself to when I stepped into my occult hierarchy role, which was, like I said, to be an artist, a la Marina Abramovich kind of shit, you know what I mean? Where it's like I'd be like pushing, occult and ritual stuff, in my artwork, essentially, and getting people like really psyched on all that like death cult stuff, basically. And then I would also begin doing more ritual stuff, on the back end, so start playing that role again, where it'd be more of a high priestess type role. And then with my own kids, I would start programming them essentially as well, at that point, because that's the expectation too, is that, with those, perpetrator allied parts, the expectation is if your hierarchy, that your kids are going to be in the same, essentially, and that you're going to be expected to put them through the same things that you went through. And that part of you sees it as like, I'm doing it for their own good. It's like you're so dissociated. It's like there's this idea that it's normal. This is just what you do. You know what I mean? So obviously never something that I dealt with. Like I said, when you get to a certain point in healing, as you start dealing with parts coming up, you recognize 100% that's what you're dealing with. And you can do a lot to, rather than acting on suicide programming or self-harm stuff or like come home programming or all of the different stuff that they put in there. Like once you get to the point in your healing that you are aware that that's what you're dealing with, it doesn't necessarily make it easier, like because you still have to go through the same like feelings and all that stuff, but if you know where it's coming from, it makes it a lot easier to manage, at least, and to like actually create some healing, understand where that part even got that from, where the trauma memory is, and then you can take that, all that intensity, whatever it is, and just make it go away, basically. So I guess the only other thing I kind of wanted to get into was like, so yeah, so by the time I was in college, like sophomore, like I said, that's when I went through the shutdown programming. I was an alcoholic. So that's one thing I think I've mentioned a few times. I've been sober. I've been um about the same amount of time I've been with my partner, so about like 11 years or so, with Billy. Um, but at the time I was like a hardcore alcoholic. It was part of how I explained away the dissociation sometimes, as I was like, maybe I just like can like, because I blacked out from alcohol, I can also it's like, but then also it's like I didn't realize how different my reaction to alcohol was compared to everyone else, until you start really understanding about it. That it's like I could have one drink and then black out. It's like that's not that's not normal. Like, it's like, and I was like, well, maybe my tolerance just keeps getting lower. I was like, that doesn't happen either, But it's like the way you rationalize things, when you're on the amnesia side of things is like, I knew I couldn't remember most of my life in our childhood, but you just get used to not looking at it, not thinking about it, all of this different stuff. So um I always joked. I think it was like being in my junior year in college. I like right after I went through all of all of this breakdown stuff. I essentially I cut off all my hair. I remember my front self. I would always say this. I never really knew what I was trying to explain. Is that I was like suddenly when I had short hair, I wasn't like I didn't dealing with assholes. This is my front self saying this, is like, but not understanding on the backside, it's because I had been essentially released from service, you know what I mean, from the fucking handlers in my life, and because of that, I was in a position where I could cut my hair, like it's like I never had control over my appearance, you know what I mean? Like anything like that. Like I remember one of my little memories I in middle school. I remember trying to have braces, like get braces, basically. Um, my dentist, and it was something that my mom now can see the DID. You know what I mean? Is that it was so out of character for me to just like I was so passive. I was so just like meek. You know what I mean? In my daytime self, and my dentist was like trying to talk me into getting braces. Basically, I have a really intense overbite. In case people haven't noticed, it's because I have two extra. I have my baby canine still. I have two extra teeth on the top. Um, Gates liked that. I don't know why, you know what I mean? But he liked that, and but also I was in rituals and they did not want me to have braces. You know what I mean? So it was like it's something stupid, you know what I mean? But it's like I was being trafficked, I had rituals and stuff like that. It's like, it wasn't the overbite wasn't a concern of his. So they didn't want me to have fucking braces, it's like they had this agenda for all the things I was doing at the time, you know what I mean? So but on my front self, it was this like no, you know what I mean? My mom, just like the way I talked to that dentist, is like she saw a switch, is what she saw, is that essentially it was, the part that knew what was expected of me in that situation and had a completely different personality, and was very forthright, and kind of snarky, you know what I mean, about things. And, it's like she was used to being the spoiled brat, basically, and was just like, no, fuck off, basically, to the dentist, And my mom was just like, I couldn't believe that, like, came out of your mouth. And that's like, later on I could be like, yeah, but it's like, this is the whole daytime, nighttime thing that we're talking about is like, at the time, it even makes sense to me, what they mean, it was so, I just was like, this is the way God made me. It's not cool with it, because that part of me wasn't vain at all, but to have talked to him or stood up for myself like that would not have happened, so like I said, didn't have control over anything. So I once I was out of there, whatever, I was hanging out with all of the crazy hipsters even more, and just like started getting even more into drugs and everything like that. We saw, I mean, still mainly drinking, but other than that, I was like, hallucinogens a little bit, and stuff. Like it's pretty normal college party scene, you know what I mean? Um, but what was I gonna say? A lot of trip stuff didn't make a lot of sense until later on in my life when I was just like, oh, like I was reliving, I was reliving shit, It's like, but you didn't have context at the time, you know what I mean? But so I just bleached my hair, you know what I mean? And I just decided to just, I was just an alcoholic, I was just partying nonstop, you know what I mean? But also kind of felt like that part finally felt like we were living our best life. We were free. Um, we had like an intentional shift in our lives in high school where, and I think I had to mention this just to you in privacy, like talking about how our lives are directed, when you're a slave of this kind of nature, that like my whole life had always on my front side been adamant that I was going to be a veterinary surgeon. It was something that to me on my front side, I couldn't even quite conceptualize the reason why it was that blood and gore and all that shit didn't bother me. I couldn't handle 2 seconds of a horror movie without fucking, running out of the room like in tears, or like just out, you know what I mean? But it's like the thought of cutting animals open and stuff was like, and being a vet, all this stuff, like I was fascinated by it, and it really was, it was what they wanted for me, for my front self, they veterinarians, in my experience, are one of the many jobs that they really want cult members in. It's you have access to all of the medical stuff essentially without actually having to be a doctor, so they do a lot of illicit type procedures, all that kinds of shit, in vets' offices essentially. So they wanted, and obviously it went hand in hand with the butchery side of things. So my whole push, even though artistically I was very talented, that was kind of like my plan B. My plan A was always that the academic stuff was that, I was super, just gifted in an academic side of things, basically, math and sciences and all that fun stuff. That essentially, but it was the thing that was most easily affected. I could see throughout my life, like in middle school, around the time of the George Miller things, or in high school, some like, but that basically that like it's the part of me that would show the burnout the most. Like, so when things were really heavy on like the occult or trafficking side of things, essentially, like it would start really showing in my academics and my ability to show up, you know what I mean, and actually excel the way I normally did in those areas, basically. Um, so by the time I was like, I was finishing up high school, I was totally checked out. I was totally burnt out. It's like I was in a high school that was essentially um, it's probably mostly victims, to be honest. Because it was a was basically like a gate high school, if you want to see it like that. It was incredibly small. We were on the campus slash in the basement of another school. All of our teachers were doctors. Doctor so and so, doctor so and so. You know what I mean? They all had doctorates, basically. There was a very like peer relationship between the doctors, between the teachers and the kids. Like all the kids were like me, they were hyper mature, super talented, either academically. Most of them were also talented. A lot of them were talented in sports, but then also like the art side of things. It's like it was just a school, like it was nationally acknowledged, multiple times the time as a public school, but that had always hit the same marks as all of the private schools, basically. It's called University High. um, but basically, our colors were black and white. Yay. Yeah. So essentially, like at that point, I was had been this total academic star, but was totally just kind of checking out, checking doing the minimum, checking the boxes and stuff like that. I didn't understand why, really, at all. But ultimately, um, I, it's like reassess you, as you're going to your next like step in life, basically. And for me, it was kind of like the switch I was talking about was supposed to happen at 35. It first happened, was supposed to take, at that age, basically, to where I was going from high school to college, because what they decided was that my academic front was too weak, essentially, and they were going to push more into the like occult side of things, being more of a personality, the more the social stuff. I essentially did a 180 flip from having no social life, 100% academic, 100% bookworm, stuck in my art, to it was like, they created this switch in the system, which was meant to be permanent, which didn't take, because like I said, I started breaking down several years later and they shut me down. That like I suddenly was a social butterfly. I was a social butterfly, everything. I was, and it felt like that part had been witnessing, like you had seen, had been witnessing from behind the scenes, like this version of me that was ineffectual in life, you know what I mean? And had been getting less and less so, because the only thing we had going for us was the academics. And now that wasn't even, there. So because they have a specific front and they want me respectable, I was going to go to college. So my guidance counselor wrote me, like filled out all the scholarship shit and showed up one day in class and just was like, here you go, you're going to the U of A. You know what I mean? Here's the scholarship that's going to pay for you. And I hadn't even applied to college because I was so burnt out. Like, I was just like, I'm I applied to schools, Art Institute of Chicago, and got in there with my portfolio and everything. But it's like I had no drive to apply for a scholarship or anything like that. So it was a total mind blowing to me to just one day be sitting in my art class and have the teacher or the guidance counselor come in and be like, here's this packet for you. Like, you're getting paid to go, you know what I mean? Like, you're on campus housing, all this different shit, that's just there for you, you know what I mean? At the time, I was so grateful, I was like, sweet. I also was kind of depressed, but I was like, whatever. But essentially, that was shortly before, it's like as soon as I moved out of the house, they, brought me back to the programming room, created this switch, and then it was social butterfly me. And what they were doing was they were pushing me to a different career path away from the veterinary surgeon, because I was showing that I couldn't do both. I couldn't do the occult role that they had for me and maintain the academics. So I was being pushed into being just to be an artist. That was my plan B. Is like I've always been very talented as an artist and picking up lots of mediums and being really technically, proficient at things, and So it was just kind of like, well, I was like, well, I've got this. I'm going to get a degree. I don't know what else to do. This is my front self. I don't know what else to do. So I guess I'll just go into art. You know what I mean? Because it's like most things felt in my life to my front self was like, it felt like I never made any decisions, but that it just was like, I just did the next thing that was expected of me, like, and for a lot of people, that wouldn't be art school, like most people would be like, dude, no one's telling you to go to art school. But people were telling me to go to art school, we're like, you're so fucking talented, all of this shit, so I was like, and yes, I was always like top of my class because I am somewhat competitive and that kind of stuff, and everything. But it's like it never felt like it was coming from the inside, you know what I mean? It's like it always felt like something I was like, you know, obligated to do because I had shown that I was good at it, So it's like with my dad, if I show I'm good at doing something, he's gonna want to, at family events, whatever, he's gonna want to parade you around, you know what I mean? Because it gives him some good feels. So a lot of times it didn't have great feels for me. So yeah, so that was basically, the intent I think then was for like what we had said the 30 at 35 was I think then the intent was that I was in art college, I was taking on the occult role, and I think at that point, they had hoped that I was going to psychopath, that I was going to step into the role that they wanted for me, celebrity artist and the occult stuff on the backside. But instead, like I said, just kept having issues, over and over again with not playing the roles I was supposed to the degree that they wanted. So they shut me down. And then when um, I had maybe a year or two or so of freedom, and then it was moving on to the next thing because I was graduating college. So each step of the way, they're going to direct. Essentially, they want to know where you're going and what you're doing and make sure it's approved. So for the next step, for me, that was going to being a tattoo artist, essentially, everyone was like, everyone was like, be a tattoo artist, you have great art, like just tattoo me. And I was just like, well, I'm not doing anything else with my life and I'm an alcoholic. So and that seems like it fits in with my lifestyle, so I was like, sure, that's what I'll start doing, you know what I mean? And I moved to a local town to get an apprenticeship with a family friend who was best friends with my uncle, who his wife was the handler who abused me my whole life practically. My dad's little brother, so it was his best friend. Was about to open up a tattoo studio. He'd been a long-term tattooer, but was about to open up a tattoo studio of his own. And then that was going to be, that was my next assignment essentially for the next until they wanted me again, because it was explained to me, that this is, and when I say this is like is people have to understand is like they explain this to like the programming part, like the parts that felt like they were in charge of the structure of the system, maintaining that order, like we had talked about. These are the parts that are getting filled in on the next steps in life because they are from the subconscious, the ones that are there to ensure that you're, taking the steps that you need to and not deviating too much from that plan. And for me, it was kind of like, I don't even know how to describe it, like a holding pattern until the cruise and they picked me up again. Where for me, like my job was essentially almost, and cult members did continue to come and get work done by me. And for them, it was pretty much playing the same role that I had in the, in the, um, in the system kind of my whole life, even in the front, because it's like I was still performing almost like a blood ritual, you know what I mean? If you were someone in the know, you know what I mean? Like, and it was almost just like a dominatrixy sex work kind of event because I'm getting paid to hurt people, There's so many ways that it was like very triggering to me, But in addition to it, it was the proximities because I worked for 7 years in a military intelligence town, you know what I mean? I'm still not too far away from it, which I hope to change, soon. But it's the type of thing where uh, it's like I was intentionally kept in a place, where I was easily accessible. I was always discouraged from doing anything that would have kept me more independent, essentially, or moving, out of, the areas that I was supposed to be in. And I was going to say, and that was my experience, is that I would have clients come in, and some of them would be people that I think were just there as, like getting off on the fact that they knew what my past role was, you know what I mean? But then there was also a lot of times where it was literally, they have people come in that are there to trigger you, prior to Paris, it was being, being essentially like triggered, them making sure that like, programming's up to snuff, all this stuff, or giving you your cues, of like, I knew based off the contract I signed that I was going to be used in a ritual the next year in Europe, but I did not know where. So I knew I was obsessed with going to Europe the next year. I was kept debating between Rome and Paris, basically, and I was obsessed with going by myself. Like I had my long-term partner and everything, and many ways that he's been looking out for me, is he was like, take your mom, like, don't go by yourself, at least take your mom, you know what I mean? It didn't change anything, obviously. Like I still went through a bunch of shit in Paris, but you know, that it's like my intense urge to do these, trips by myself, you know what I mean? That on the front feels like, oh, it's rational. It's because I'm so burnt out with work. The only reason I was burnt out with work is because of all the shit which I was dealing with on the night side of things. But I'm like, I'm burnt out with work. I need to just like get serious about being a real artist again, because it was all the stuff that I've been told with the contract. Be a real artist. I'm gonna get that. So I'm going to go to Paris. I'm going to get the inspiration I need, on the front side. And on the back side, it was just knowing that I had been just waiting to be told, am I going to go to Paris or am I going to go to Rome? You know what I mean? And once I get there, I know I'm going to have some role to perform. So after Paris is like when the healing really began, I guess. I can kind of get into that briefly if you want. Okay, so um after Paris, I like I said, I was never meant to play these roles. And it was one ritual, and then all the breakdowns started happening again. I started experiencing a lot of mental health symptoms. I was experiencing panic attacks, overwhelming anxiety. My depression had become kind of like unmanageable, and stuff like that. And I started seeing a therapist finally the next month, and saw him for about a year and a half with very little success, because initially in therapy, I had the mask up for the team 100%. I couldn't even verbalize my emotions. The only reason I got into therapy was because someone told me that maybe my stomach issues were connected to anxiety. And like I was like, oh, like maybe I'm like, what is anxiety? Like, what is anger? What is sad? Like it was like literally like it's like kind of like once I started thinking about it, I realized like I had this like very like narrow bandwidth of emotions essentially, and everything else I just like dissociated and did not like understand or connect with. And but once I started, Paris just started all the PTSD symptoms, coming up, and I was struggling so much and trying to find answers. I tried therapy, tried medication, like it nothing made sense to me. And I got to the point where I was all I was doing was the only thing that seemed to help was like when I did meditation classes essentially, and I would learn essentially how to start like understanding what was going on in my head and think about my thinking and stuff, and I could start creating some clarity in everything. But I went to retreat after retreat and I got a little bit of clarity, and it's still just like, I just was overwhelmed, with all of these emotions I had no context for. And I got to the point where I just get, I wanted to give up. We deal with a lot of suicide programming when emotions and stuff are coming up anyway. But especially at this time, it's like I had no context and I felt useless. I was like, if I can't fix myself, what am I going to do for anyone else in the world? So I ended up, I I was making plans, I was getting rid of items, I was getting rid of rehoming pets, I was doing all this stuff, and came down to the point where I was ready to kill myself basically because I had, it was all the suicide programming, but it's also dealing with all of the incest memories and stuff coming up, and I went to a last retreat basically at a Buddhist temple and experienced my heart be opened essentially. It's the only way I can explain it. It was a God moment. It was in the retreat, in the chanting, in the fasting, and the prayer, and all that stuff. There was a point at which, like, it felt like my heart had been cut off, and like it had just opened, and I suddenly felt like I had always been a compassionate person, but it's like I started feeling it for myself. I think, like I started like feeling it, and not just like being like, yes, I love and I'm compassionate towards everyone, you know what I mean? But I never felt it for myself. And I started tapping into my heart, but that meant I started tapping into my pain, you know what I mean? And that was my experience is that I on that retreat, it was the nightmares began, just like it was just like everything, like it just felt like, and it was overwhelming, and I had no context for it. And I was having dreams of my dad murdering people and murdering me, and just like this craziest shit, you know what I mean? And I like was like, I am coming from this like intense retreat and I feel worse. You know what I mean? Like it's like I like it because it was like starting to deal with the flooding of all of the trauma that I had dealt with and I had always been able to keep away and I had wanted to heal. That's why I was there, as I was seeking healing and love and everything. And you ask and God answers. And but it was, it's with dealing with the memories. It also was a suicide program to the 10th, and I just felt worse. And I was just like, dude, I'm hopeless. Like if I can't get to a place of functioning with myself, what am I ever going to do for other people? And so, like I said, I was at the point where it just was getting rid of everything. I ended up, but it was my mom, and Billy too, that saved me because I just was like, dude, I don't give a fuck what happens to me, but I just know that I can't imagine putting them through this. So instead I told my mom where I was at, and got got into a hospital instead, which is still not the best place for healing for people. But if you're in crisis, it's definitely better than the alternative. So that's all I'll say, you know what I mean? But it propelled, it was the beginning of the rest of my life, you know what I mean? Like was starting to learn about my emotions in the hospital and then starting to begin to in intensive outpatient afterwards deal with them and then start realizing that everything I was dealing with was PTSD basically, from the incest initially around my father. And um it's and that's what I'll just briefly say on like the healing and stuff like that is like it's a journey and it's layers, and how my layers tended to work, is that deeper parts need to have role modeled by other parts, that you can go through the process of healing and handle that information, handle that intensity of emotion, handle all that shit before the parts that have heavier traumas are willing to share with you, basically. And that was totally my experience until we got to a place of understanding our dissociative system, understanding that we were incest survivors and everything, until we got to that place and had a model of being able to heal and function through that shit, we were not able to deal with the trafficking stuff. And then once we dealt with the trafficking stuff, it's like when we had enough context to understand, everything we went through with the more military and occult kind of things, because that is, that's how the abuses were built on in my system in general, too. But you also can't have context for those more intense things unless you really dealt with, you know, the other stuff. And it is like you choosing, to look at those things. But what I will say is one thing that's mind boggling to me, kind of like that picture that we showed in the very beginning, is that I was, you know, 6 years later in healing, I was like looking, I can look through old journals or remember conversations I had with like my therapist in the beginning where I was talking about the shit that I dealt with later in healing. I initially told my therapist, in the first couple of sessions, that I felt like I had been a high priced prostitute. Like I was like, I don't know why I would think this. I was like, I don't know why I would have like images of me being on a bed with a line of men standing outside the door. Like this is all stuff that was like, and I would just, I'm just crazy. And then this is stuff that was coming up during the incest memories. You know what I mean? So I was dealing with all of this shit, but because I had zero context for it, it was just like I don't even know what to do with this. You know what I mean? So you just kind of like almost like redissociate it. You're just like, I don't know what this is. So I'm just gonna push it back away. But then later on in healing, you can look back and be like, whoa, it was almost like it's almost like dream logic or kid parts that are finally old enough to communicate what they were trying to say, fucking years ago, basically. Um, so yeah, I mean, and I guess the last thing I'll say with like triggering is that like it's a good thing too, is that like the only reason I dealt with my ritual abuse memories is because I had my son, my beautiful, amazing, like light of my life son. He's 2 now. And like it was Nathan Reynolds has talked about this, it was so painful. That's part of like what makes me so upset about my abuse, is to know how much pain I went through just trying to like be a mom, initially, because it's like I just like just seeing, just changing his diaper and seeing his like, and it wasn't like his privates or anything. It was just seeing his like his torso, his naked torso, because it had just been something I'd seen so many times in such horrible situations, you know what I mean? Like, and to just like, you know, just have someone, have all the joy of like my son and like my birth, it felt like me taking my body back because it was exactly the way I wanted it. It was a natural birth. It was, at my mom's house. It was a beautiful, beautiful event. And it felt like I had a midwife and everyone that really honored, what my needs were and understood me and everything like that. And it was a beautiful experience that felt like, me taking my body, my womb, especially as a woman and going through all this shit, back and turning it into something really, really undeniably beautiful. But that's also the difficult stuff is that like, is that to get to this place of healing, I had to come through like so much pain and not being present with my son, like I was so lucky that he didn't cry a ton, because it's like Nathan, it's like the intense cries and it just makes me want to fucking be in a fetal position on the ground, because it's like I associate with so much other shit, you know what I mean? But luckily I've had, he's a joy, God sent me the perfect baby. He's always been, a joyful, present, and he hasn't been, he doesn't cry a lot, he's just wonderful, exactly what I needed to be able to get through this like season of healing for sure. Because that is, you know, realistically, we are going to deal with things in our healing, whether or not, sometimes whether or not we want to deal with them, but when we need to deal with them, and that was like, it's like, if I didn't have my son, I probably could have gone my whole life without dealing with my ritual abuse memories and the monarch shit. And I would have continued to deal with probably a shit ton of triggers and I would have had a lot of parts buried and I probably would have, gone crazy this past birthday and everything like that, but that's like why I'm here and I healed and everything because I had a reason to, it's not just my partner, it's my son, so it's like as this shit comes up, it's like there's a reason to work your way through it, and that's just what I want to encourage other people to like keep in mind, especially if you're in a time of like really of intensity, with like triggering and life stuff. And it's just like, and you just want a pity party and stuff like that. Like, it's a shitty place to be in, but it's also what I constantly come back to is like, I did not even realize how present and happy I could be with my son until I worked through the stuff that I needed to, and I'm I'm grateful that I'm where I'm at today, regardless of all the suffering that I'm at, and um, I'm grateful to him and I'm grateful to my partner. Like I said, we've just recently got married. So, after we've been together for like 12 years, but so we were pretty much married already, but he's been an insane, a support throughout everything to where it's like, I just want to take a moment to just thank my family, because they're why I'm here.
You're so deserving of that. And your son is so lucky to have you as a mom. I look at so many parents now who didn't go through what you did, and they don't have anywhere close to the level of attention and intention and love and compassion that you do, and it's really sad, seeing what parenting is like kind of these days, how trauma has really affected everybody, not just, um, you know, extreme trauma survivors, but regular people who, might have had a more normal upbringing, and it still is being perpetuated because we're just so unaware of trauma. Like we're a very um non-trauma informed society, and you see that on all different levels, but it's amazing what you've done, Carrie. Like that is the most powerful thing that a person can do, is take back their power and not pass it on and not perpetuate the things that we went through onto somebody else, and you are just an absolutely incredible mother. You're an incredible woman, and seeing how far you've come, it's beautiful. It's a miracle, and it's an inspiration, and it's something to me that has touched my heart dearly to like experience you and to get to hear all of these experiences and to see what that little girl went through, and how somebody could meet you today and just have absolutely no idea what your past entails. It's mind-boggling in a lot of ways, but people on the other side of the screen need to hear you, and they're listening, and what you've learned is going to impact people, and it is impacting people, and it's a gift that you can now give and share and help other people break their own chains of trauma, and understanding what they went through or what they're experiencing and how to take their power back and to not pass it on to their kids, or to stop it if it has started, and just what a beautiful thing. You mentioned in an episode, I think it was 2 episodes ago, it might have been 3 episodes ago. And for people listening, if you're new here, Carrie has a lot of episodes on my channel, so go listen to all of them. They're amazing. But, you had mentioned before that you chose this life, that you had a divine calling, that your soul chose to come into what you experienced, not to experience it, but to help other people who have experienced it have an easier time, and to help inform society that this is still happening and that they should care. And girl, you are living up to that. I believe that 100%, and I'm so upset that that was the choice that you had to make a difference, that this is still happening, and that, it hasn't stopped, that you didn't get to choose, a beautiful life. And part of that makes me, want to say like shame on society, like it's terrible that this has been passed down, that people haven't stopped it, but it's going to be people like you, Carrie, that do,
And you.
and we're really lucky that we have you here to educate us all on all of this, and at the end of the day, to give us hope. There's so much darkness that you went through, but on the other side of that, you bring that light. You're lighting other people's fire, and you're turning on their light switches and helping them understand and giving them hope and setting an example of what's on the other side of the hard work of healing, and that it's worth it, that you can have a beautiful marriage, that you can have the parenting experience that you want, that's not tainted with, control and pain, that, and that you can overcome what pain does come with parenting after this, and I just thank you with all my heart for, being so vulnerable and sharing your artwork. I know that that's like a very personal thing. They're your memories, and I'm sure it was really traumatic when you actually put those on paper as you're going through a flashback, and we're all better for what you're doing, and I know you're just getting started. You have a lot of things that I know you'll announce soon enough that you're working on, and lots of advancements with being able to progress in this community, and you're just such a bright light, and we're all really lucky that we have you. And I've seen you grow so much in such a short amount of time, and I'm really excited to see, what a year looks like from now for you, what 2 years, what 5 years looks like, it's going to be really powerful what you're going to accomplish. And we're really lucky that we get to experience it here on a very small scale. One day I hope you're on a stage with millions of people watching you, and you're giving these speeches and helping empower society. So just thank you
As
for
long as
coming
it
on and
helps,
sharing.
I'll do it.
We appreciate you. And I just, thank you for coming on today and for sharing all of this.
Thank you so much, Emma. I mean, as always, this conversation really lifts me up. If it was just the two of us, but just knowing that like it's um, reaching so many people on the survivor and advocate side of things that it's going to help connect some dots for or create some insight for something. It does make it makes the work worth it on a whole nother level, and is super encouraging to me, just as far as like what we're looking at as far as a society in general. Is we're headed in the right direction. I'm like certain of that. So
100%. And I know like we had looked at some really amazing questions that people had submitted. So I want to
do a
invite
Q&A.
you
I
on.
had a feeling
Yeah,
that might happen.
it'd be awesome to
I've
do
been
a
talking
Q&A with
and
you. That's what I was gonna say, because we could start asking questions, but we'd be here all night. There was some really, and thank you for, submitting questions, everybody on the other side. If you guys have questions from this episode or just for Carrie that you'd like us to talk about in a future episode, I encourage you guys to write that in the comments. And maybe what we can do next is, a Q&A episode and, take all these questions and get through some of them as best as we can. But
yeah.
I'd love for you to share the things that you have been working on. You have a YouTube channel that has a lot of informative and educational and inspiring short-ish videos. They're not as long as what we do here on this podcast. They're like the perfect amount, I feel, to pack in a lot of information in a short amount of time. And I'd love for you to talk about what you're doing on your YouTube channel. And I know you're sort of pivoting to not necessarily a new direction, but you're growing what you've already started. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. I probably won't share too much about that yet. Probably next time, But yeah, as far as what channel goes, I am always going to recommend people to check it out because um so my goal, I always come back to with that channel, is that like realistically, I think a lot of my success in healing has been learning to communicate these concepts to multiple different parts. Essentially is that like that's what we need to do as fronts, is bridge the gap, in understanding between all of our different parts. And most of our parts are traumatized kids, so I think that's always been like the goal behind my channel, is to take things that I've learned in, DID, DDoNS literature, programming literature, meditation, all the different things, Kathy O'Brien's, views on journaling. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I've kind of almost tried to like synthesize, the things that have been important to me in my healing journey. But a lot of it I'm trying to simplify in a way that it can be talked about, in a way that almost like kids, or the lay person who didn't experience it can understand, because my goal for this is that it would be for more and I might do more advanced stuff later, but my goal so far is for it to create more understanding for people that are especially newer in healing, like that maybe understand about DID, but maybe don't understand quite as much about really conceptualizing that and DDoNS, the ritual abuse, the mind control side of things, because there is, it's like DID on steroids, basically. So it's just trying to create what I feel like would be the resource I wanted, early in healing, which is a very simple, straightforward way to conceptualize the things that we're working on in healing and therapy and stuff like that, and kind of figuring out how to come up with um, our own methods or tools for handling the healing, because it's going to be consistent. You having to learn how to manage flashbacks, how to learn how to ground yourself, how to learn, just how to create increased internal communication within the system. So it's more me trying to help people, like, through my own experience, just kind of come up with their own ways that help them kind of see their way out of this internal mental maze that we kind of get stuck in.
And I love your channel because it talks on things that survivors can do. So you have a lot of journal prompts on here and exercises. So it's an activity-based channel as well as informative, to where you can listen to other
Yes.
videos and get education on what is DID, what is dissociation, what are those things like to deal with. And I love that. I love that there's, sort of something on here for everybody. And I think it's also really valuable, not just for survivors and advocates, but this is really valuable for therapists and helpers who are treating, healing, working with, doing therapy with survivors and maybe are new to DID, and, dealing with somebody who's experienced extreme trauma. I know that that's not covered a lot in, uh, American academia or, anywhere in the world. I think it's generally pretty stripped out of academia. So this is really helpful too, I think, for helping with basic things that you can do to help a survivor who comes to you, and discloses. And a lot of this is really, I mean, if you listen across the board to survivors and to therapists who have been working with survivors for a significant amount of time, or who have been healing for a significant amount of time, Carrie's work is very consistent with what is recommended to sort of start with, and she puts her own beautiful twist on it, on things that we can do modern day that are newer than what was discovered 20 years ago by some people. It's a more of a modern day take on how we can do this, and she incorporates some of her own things like meditation. She's teaching us a skill that she's learned and has honed, and sharing how we can use it to help deal with being a multiple. So it's really interesting, and I love what you've done here, Carrie. I love that it's interactive, but it's also informative, and people have loved these different exercises. It's really helpful. It's hard to find this information, honestly. Like, if I didn't know about this stuff, and, I was just looking online, it would be really hard to sort of navigate, like, what is this that I have? What do you mean I have parts or like a system? Like, where do I start with this? It's really neat that you're helping create that, and that you solved your own problem. This is the channel that you would have essentially wanted when you were waking up. And I encourage everybody to go support and share. There's more and more survivors every day coming forward, you guys, and if you haven't had somebody in your life come forward to you, I feel like it's just a matter of time before you do. And it's our responsibility to be informed about this. And then also on the other end, as a survivor, it's your duty to heal in a sense. So we're breaking that cycle, and that's a hard journey in itself, but it's easier now that we do have the Kathy O'Briens and the Carries and, different people contributing, the John Eulers coming forward and helping contribute helpful ways that we can navigate that process, and really put a stop to this, and help us understand, and help us take action. So thank you, Carrie, for creating this. I love your channel, and I know everybody else does too that has discovered it. And I'm excited to see what more you have to add to it, and to keep watching your videos grow. And then also you're on Twitter. So I just wanted to bring that up too for people who might be on that platform. A lot more people are going to Twitter. You're on there with the same name, Desert Dakini. There's the underscore between the two words. And you post the interviews that you're doing, and you post different things that inspire you, and you share other survivor posts on here. So for people listening, if you want to keep in touch with Carrie sort of day to day, or have access to her to where you can, support her in real life when she's not on YouTube. You can go on there and share her posts and lift her up and get eyes on her on that platform also. And again, that's Desert Dakini, and that's the same on YouTube as well. And I don't have any trouble whenever I just put those two words in together, Desert Dakini, you pop right up. There's not like a million people that have that name. So
Yeah, I doubt it.
so it's really easy to find her on these platforms too. Um, Let me put this down. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about, Carrie, today?
No, I think that that was pretty much everything I had hoped to go over. I guess I didn't get really into detail about the memory recovery stuff, but that's kind of where I feel like if we do a Q&A or something coming up, that would be, I think there was already some questions about it, so we can get into the specifics of, being the position of dealing with memory is dealing. I think a lot of that people's questions are about that, so yeah, so I think that this is pretty much kind of like what I wanted to kind of finish going over with like the testimony side of things, just to kind of finish giving people a good idea of the overall the overall arc of my life and the abuse, that a survivor goes through.
Thank you so much for doing all of this, to get to experience your life and what you've learned from it. It's really helpful and impactful for all of us. And like I said, everybody, I'll have her links in the show notes. So I'll have her YouTube channel and her Twitter. Go connect with her, get eyes on her, share her stuff, reach out to her, tell her how amazing she is. And of course, share this episode, and share the episodes that are on her YouTube channel too. It's a really it's a great way that we can not only support the work of a survivor, but it's a free tool to help somebody, if you are in a position to help, or even if it's you that needs help. We have access now to so many different resources that survivors are contributing, and we should be eating all of that up, because it's really hard to find literature on it, or to find a trauma-informed therapist, or a pastor even. I feel like at this point, like it's our responsibility in a weird way. Now that we know about this, we need to go inform people and be like, hey, like you're a therapist. Do you know that this exists? You're a pastor. Did you know that this exists? No. Well, here's a helpful YouTube channel, or here's a book, or, there's so many different ways now that we can help empower people to, take responsibility. And the more people that we wake up to this, the less it's a conspiracy theory, and we make this more of a sort of mainstream house conversation, to where it's normalized and it's something that's not so obscure anymore. It's sort of our responsibility to do that now in a weird way, because the government's not going to do it for us. So, we have to come together and help, champion sharing and distributing this information, so we can help inform people and, like I said, make it more of a normal conversation. So I will have all of Carrie's links in the show notes. Connect with me too on all platforms. All these different social media platforms are so weird with, what we can and can't talk about. And I never know sort of if I'll get a strike, or, if something's going to be taken offline. So it really helps too if you guys just kind of support it wherever you can. Even if it's just for the sole purpose of keeping in touch, just in case your preferred platform goes down, or, something happens to it. So I'll have all my links too below, you guys. Connect with me wherever you can. Connect with Carrie. We couldn't do this without you guys. We really appreciate you guys tuning in and listening. I know everybody loves when Carrie comes on, so we'll be looking forward to her coming on again eventually, and talking more about her healing journey and, the different things that she's working on. So you guys, thank you so much for listening. God bless you, and we will see you next time.